I was stationed in Arizona when it happened just a few years back, and I still don't talk about it much. I worked for a small geological survey outfit, a private firm contracted occasionally by universities and the Bureau of Land Management. Our job was to monitor shifts in the earth, fault lines, and anything that might suggest tectonic instability in the American Southwest. Most days, it was a slog through dust, heat, and little else. But one trip out to the Sonoran Desert, out past Ajo, turned my stomach inside out and has kept me up more nights than I can count. We'd been called to investigate seismic activity just outside of an abandoned mining site. It wasn't anything urgent, more like a curiosity that some university lab tech picked up on a long-range monitor. Nothing official. But the company sent me and a guy named Rich anyway, mostly just to justify the grant they were getting paid from. Rich was a newer guy, older than me, in his early 50s maybe. Thick arms, sun-worn face, and a voice that never rose above a mumble. He'd worked oil rigs in Texas and was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. I didn't know what his deal was, and he didn't ask much about mine. We both preferred silence, which made it easier. We left Tucson around 5 in the morning with our gear packed in the bed of a beat-up company truck. GPS was mostly useless where we were going. Out past Ajo, you hit long stretches of gravel and sand that aren't on any map. The land bleeds out into itself, and you can drive for hours without seeing another living soul. By the time we reached the site, it was late afternoon. The sun was beginning its slow descent, lighting up the rocks in burnt orange and deep red. The old mining site looked like something out of time, a handful of collapsing structures, rusted machinery, and a mine entrance boarded up with planks barely holding together. I remember thinking how unnatural it all looked, how the desert had almost swallowed it completely. We set up our equipment maybe 30 yards from the mine. A pair of seismographs, ground microphones, and a laptop we powered with a portable generator. The job was supposed to take 2 days max. Plant the monitors, get readings, leave. I should have known something was wrong the first night. Around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped hard. That's not unusual in the desert, but it felt wrong, like the cold wasn't natural. I woke up in my tent shaking, my breath fogging up inside the nylon walls. I checked my phone, but of course no signal. The stars were so bright above us it almost looked fake, like someone had painted them onto a sheet of obsidian. Then I heard it, a low hum, like someone humming a lullaby through gritted teeth. At first I thought it was Rich, maybe snoring weird, but when I unzipped my tent and looked across to his, I saw him sitting up outside, staring toward the mine. "What are you doing?" I called quietly, trying not to spook him. He didn't answer, just kept staring. I stepped closer. "Rich?" Finally, he looked up at me, and even in the dim starlight, I could see something was off in his face. His eyes were wide open, and his lips were moving, but no sound was coming out, just mouthing something over and over. "What the hell's wrong with you?" I said, putting a hand on his shoulder. He snapped out of it like someone had poured cold water over him. He blinked and shook his head, looking around like he didn't know where he was. "You all right?" Yeah?" he muttered. "Bad dream, I guess?" He didn't say anything else, just went back into his tent. I stood out there for a long while, staring toward the boarded-up mine entrance. I felt that same hum again, not in my ears this time, but in my bones, like the earth was breathing. The next day we stayed busy collecting data, but I could tell Rich wasn't himself. He kept glancing toward the mine, wouldn't eat, didn't say a word for hours. At one point, he walked off behind some rocks, and I thought he was just taking a leak, but he didn't come back for nearly an hour. When he did, his face was gray, and he was sweating despite the cool wind. I asked him what happened, and he just shook his head. "Something's not right out here," he finally said. "We shouldn't be here." "You mean like the mine?" I asked. He didn't answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things, whispers in the wind that sounded like voices. Sometimes just beyond my tent, I swore I heard footsteps crunching the sand. I got up twice and walked the perimeter of our camp, rifle in hand, but nothing. No prints. No sign of anyone but us. Then, a little after midnight, I heard the generator sputter and go doe-dead. I stepped out of the tent and saw Rich standing by it. He looked pale, eyes wide again. "Why'd you turn it off?" I asked. "I didn't," he replied, almost whispering. Then we heard something. Something from inside the mine. It was faint at first, like tapping. Then it grew louder, more rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. I looked at Rich and saw real fear on his face. He was backing away from the mine slowly. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe some morbid sense of curiosity, or maybe the hum I'd felt in my bones had gotten deeper, closer to my head now, like it was whispering inside me. Either way, I grabbed my flashlight and started toward the mine. "Don't," Rich said behind me, but his voice was weak. I shined my light through the gaps in the old wooden boards. Nothing. Just dark. But the tapping stopped the moment the beam hit it. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. Then something moved fast, just beyond the reach of the flashlight. I heard the scuff of gravel, like someone dragging their foot in a hurry. Then silence. Rich pulled me back hard. "We leave now," he said. "Leave the gear. I don't care." I nodded. I didn't care either. We packed our personal gear in minutes, leaving behind the laptops, the monitors, everything. We were in the truck and peeling away before either of us said another word. After about 5 miles of driving through the dirt road, the truck began to stutter. The dashboard lights flickered, and then we stopped. Dead. Rich tried the key again. Nothing. "You've got to be kidding me." Then we heard the hum again. This time, louder. Closer. "Something's following us," Rich said, eyes scanning the horizon. "It doesn't want us to leave." We sat in silence for minutes. The desert around us was pitch black. The stars above now seemed distant, muted. That's when I saw the figure, about 30 yards away, standing perfectly still. It looked like a man, but too tall, and the proportions were wrong. Arms too long, head slightly tilted, no detail to the face, just dark. "Do you see it?" I asked, voice cracking. Rich didn't answer. He was staring too. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. Then all at once, it took a step. I floored the gas. The truck didn't move. Another step. My heart slammed in my chest. Then, without warning, the engine roared to life. I didn't ask questions. I slammed it into drive and peeled off, leaving a cloud of dust behind. We didn't stop until we reached Ayo and checked into a motel. Didn't even talk until morning. I reported what little data we'd managed to collect. Didn't mention the mine. The company didn't ask questions. They wrote it off as a faulty survey and cut us from the project. I tried to move on, got a different assignment, left the desert. A few months later, I got a call from the company. A new team had been sent to the site. They'd stopped responding. Authorities found the truck abandoned. No sign of the men. No tracks, just one of the laptops sitting open, its screen cracked and blinking gibberish. I asked if they saw anything in the mine. The man on the phone paused, then said quietly, "We don't go out there anymore." Rich quit not long after, moved somewhere in the northeast, off-grid. I haven't spoken to him since. I don't blame him. I still think about the figure sometimes. That hum, that mine. There's something buried in the Sonoran Desert, something that isn't human and isn't dead either. I don't know what it wants, but I know this much. It doesn't like to be watched, and it doesn't forget who sees it. Story the end. There's a part of Nevada between Ely and Tonopah that isn't on many maps. Not because it's hidden, but because there's nothing there. Just scrub brush, dry wind, a 2-lane highway that runs so straight it feels like the world ends if you stare too far ahead. People don't stop in that stretch unless their car forces them to. And that's exactly what happened to me in July 2018. I'd taken a job hauling a trailer full of antique slot machines from Reno to Phoenix. The buyer was a collector who wanted a private casino in his home. Rich people do weird things. I didn't think much of the route. I'd driven worse. I'd driven through Wyoming in February, Nebraska during a tornado, and once even through Arkansas with busted AC. The desert heat was nothing new, but the stretch of road between Ely and Tonopah had this odd silence, not just in sound, but in feel. Like the desert didn't just want to be empty, but meant to be. You could look around for miles and see nothing move. No birds, no rabbits, not even bugs hitting the windshield, just long shadows and that ever-present hum of heat on metal. It was about 2:30 p.m. when my pickup started to stutter. A light on the dash flickered, then the engine whined like it was choking. I slowed, thinking maybe it was the fuel filter, but before I could even pull off to the side, the truck died. Just flat out stopped in the middle of nowhere. No signal on the phone, not even one bar. I got out and opened the hood like I'd know what to do, but it all looked the same, hot, dusty, lifeless. The nearest town, if you could even call it that, had to be at least 50 miles either way. I was alone. No cars had passed in over an hour. I started to feel it then, this weight like the desert had pressed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Stay here. Don't go." I waited a bit, tried the ignition again. Nothing. I got out a jug of water and sat on the trailer hitch in the shade, what little there was of it, and tried to think. I'm not easily spooked. I've seen meth heads in Montana, got shot at in New Orleans once, but there was something about that silence. I realized I couldn't even hear the wind anymore. I must have sat there an hour before I noticed the dust plume. A car or a truck coming fast. Relief flooded me. I stood and waved both arms, walking toward the road, but as the vehicle approached, something felt off. It wasn't just fast, it was jerky, like it sped up and slowed down in bursts. As it got closer, I realized it wasn't following the road exactly, but kind of weaving across it. I stepped back. It was an old white Suburban, probably early 90s. Rust along the fenders, tinted windows, front grille half cracked. It pulled up and stopped about 10 feet in front of me, engine idling, but no one got out. The driver's window didn't roll down. I stepped to the side, trying to peer in, but the glass was so dark I couldn't see anything. Just my reflection, warped and sweaty. I knocked once on the window. No answer. Just the soft rumble of the engine. I backed off, unease crawling up my neck. The door opened. A man stepped out. Average height, lean, maybe late 40s. He wore faded jeans, a long-sleeved flannel, in that heat, and a trucker hat pulled low. His face was sun-worn, like old leather, and when he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. "Truck trouble?" he asked, voice dry and flat. "Yeah, died on me. No signal either." He nodded slowly, looked at my pickup without really looking at it. "You alone?" Something about the way he asked it put me on edge. I nodded but kept my distance. "I can give you a ride to Goldfield," he said. "It's about 40 miles. Got a mechanic there." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say yes and be done with the silence. But something else, something primal, held me back. Every instinct screamed no. I forced a smile. "Appreciate it. I think I'll wait a little longer. Might be able to flag someone else down." He didn't respond at first. Just looked at me with those flat eyes. Then he turned and walked to the back of his Suburban, opened it. I couldn't see what he was doing, but he was back there for a while. Then I heard it, a dragging sound. Something heavy being pulled across metal. My stomach turned. I took a slow step back toward my truck. The man reappeared, arms empty, but he smiled again, this time wider. "You sure?" "Yeah," I said. "I'll be all right." He paused, then nodded. Climbed back into the Suburban, but didn't drive off. Just sat there, idling. 5 minutes passed. 10. I got back in my pickup and locked the doors. Still no signal. The Suburban stayed parked. Finally, after what had to be 20 minutes, it pulled off slowly, heading east. I waited until it disappeared over a hill, then I got out, walked to the back of my trailer, and checked under it. There were drag marks in the dirt behind his car. Long ones, like something had been pulled out and dropped. No footprints, just 2 grooves leading to nothing. That night, I slept in the cab. I locked every door and kept my pocket knife in hand. The desert grew cold. Still no wind, no stars. Just that awful silence. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound I hadn't heard in almost 24 hours. Tires on asphalt. I sat up, heart pounding. Headlights appeared on the horizon. I prayed it was someone new. But as they got closer, my blood ran cold. Same white Suburban, same cracked grille. It slowed down when it got near my truck. Real slow. Then stopped directly across from me. I ducked low in the cab, turned off my flashlight. My breathing was loud in the silence. I waited. The driver's door opened. I held my breath. Footsteps crunched against the gravel, slow, measured, one after the other, coming toward my side. I slid the knife from my pocket, clutched it so tight my palm started to sweat. Then silence. He stopped just outside my door. I could feel him there, a tap. Light, just a single tap on the window. Then he said it, almost a whisper. "You alone?" I stayed frozen. Another tap, louder this time. "I can give you a ride now." I didn't speak, didn't move. He stayed there for a minute longer. Then, slowly, I heard him walk back. The door creaked open. The Suburban started, headlights flicked on, but he didn't leave. He parked there, engine idling, until the sun came up. When the first light hit the horizon, he finally drove off. I waited another hour before climbing out of the cab. My mouth was dry, my legs shaky. I checked around the truck. Nothing. But behind my trailer, again, there were marks. Long drag marks. This time, though, they ended at the side of my truck, like something had been pulled right up to it, like he had tried to take something or someone. Around 9 a.m., a van finally pulled over, a family of tourists. I flagged them down and told them my engine had died. The dad offered me a ride to Tonopah. I didn't hesitate. I left the truck behind. A few days later, I returned with a tow. The mechanic said there was nothing wrong with the engine, just that the battery had disconnected, like someone had loosened it. But it wasn't loose when I parked. I asked about strange people on the road, anyone driving an old Suburban. The guy at the station got quiet, said, "You saw the Desert Man, didn't you?" I asked what he meant. He told me years ago, a drifter in a white Suburban was found dead near Goldfield. Body had been rotting in the heat for weeks before anyone noticed. They say he was picking up stranded travelers and killing them. Some said he just dumped the bodies in mine shafts. Others believed he took them home, but no one ever found his house. The truck was impounded, but since then, people say they've seen him. Always the same. Pulls up to broken down cars, offers rides, smiles too wide. The guy told me not to stop next time, not even if I'm dying. Sometimes the desert wants you to stay, he said, and sometimes he wants to help it. I didn't argue. I sold that trailer a week later, never took another job through Nevada, and I never drive that stretch of highway again. Story the end. In the fall of 2019, I took a contract job cataloging wildlife patterns in remote regions of the Sonoran Desert. I was a biologist by trade, used to tracking mountain lions, coyotes, and all sorts of desert life, and this job was supposed to be routine. The Arizona Department of Game and Fish was trying to get updated numbers on the dwindling desert tortoise population, so they partnered with a small group of independent field scientists like me. The deal was simple. 3 weeks in the field, no cell reception, no contact with the outside world, just me and my equipment, logging sightings and burrow locations. I had done stuff like this before. I wasn't new to being alone, nor to the harsh heat, so I wasn't nervous when I loaded up my Jeep with gear and headed out. The area I was assigned was about 40 miles south of Gila Bend, an expanse of land with no trails, no ranger stations, and only one service road leading into it. I passed the last sign of human life, a crumbling gas station with a rusted sign and boarded up windows, and drove for hours through terrain that was nothing but cracked earth and scrub. Eventually, I reached my designated site, a small patch of land near the edge of an arroyo where the department had dropped a supply crate weeks earlier. It was peaceful out there. Silent in a way only the desert can be, like the air itself is holding its breath. I set up camp on the flat ground a few hundred yards from the arroyo, positioned my weatherproof tent so the opening faced east, and placed my solar charger in direct sun. Days passed quietly. I spent my mornings hiking through the arroyos and ridges, checking burrows and leaving flag markers, and my evenings entering data into a battered laptop and cooking freeze-dried food over a tiny camp stove. On the 6th night, something changed. I had just finished eating and was sitting in a folding chair, staring at the sky turning violet behind the hills. The wind was unusually still. Not a single blade of creosote or mesquite moved. And then I heard it, a sharp, dry click from the arroyo. Not an animal sound, not the shuffle of a lizard or the hiss of wind. It sounded like stone hitting stone. I turned my head and stared into the darkening ravine, seeing nothing. After a few minutes, I shook it off. The desert is full of strange echoes. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m., sweating. My tent was sweltering, and the air felt heavier than usual. I unzipped the door flap and stuck my head out to cool off. And that's when I saw the figure. Not more than 50 yards away, just on the edge of the starlight, someone or something stood motionless. No flashlight, no gear, just a dark silhouette standing dead still, facing me. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch when I stared at it. I whispered, "Hello?" and waited, but nothing. After a minute or two, I ducked back into my tent, zipped it up, and grabbed the flare gun from my pack. I listened for footsteps, for crunching gravel, anything, but the night remained silent. Eventually, after maybe half an hour, I dared to peek again. Nothing was there. The next morning, I walked down to where the figure had stood. No footprints, not even disturbed dirt, just that same dry, crusted earth. I told myself I must have been dreaming. Heat does that. Loneliness too. Still, the rest of the day, I kept looking over my shoulder, my hand never far from my flare gun. That evening, as I reviewed photos from my motion-triggered wildlife camera, I nearly dropped the tablet. One of the images, time-stamped around 1:57 a.m., showed something walking along the ridge above my tent. It was human-shaped, but too tall. Lanky. The arms seemed too long, almost dragging by its sides, and the head was wrong, misshapen, like it was wearing a hood made of bone. I told myself it had to be a camera glitch or a trick of shadows. I deleted the photo without thinking, but I shouldn't have. I should have saved it. Sent it to someone. The next night, I didn't sleep. I sat outside the tent with my headlamp on, scanning the horizon. Every few minutes I swore I saw movement, quick flickers of motion just outside the range of the light. Around 3 a.m., I finally nodded off in my chair. I don't know how long I was out before I jolted awake to the sound of something sniffing. Close. Right next to me. I snapped the flashlight up. Nothing. Just dust swirling in the beam. Then I noticed something new. A pattern in the sand just a few feet from my chair. Long, dragging footprints. Not like boots or shoes. Bare, narrow, and clawed. I grabbed my gear and ran into the tent, barely able to zip it closed before I dropped the flare gun in my lap. I sat there until sunrise, gripping the handle so hard my knuckles ached. By morning, most of the tracks were gone. The desert winds had smoothed them over, but I could still make out a few deep impressions. I snapped photos and tried calling my supervisor on the satellite radio. No response. I tried again every hour. Still nothing. I knew I should leave, but my contract wasn't up for another 4 days, and the agreement was strict. Early departure without emergency justification meant forfeiting my final pay. I convinced myself to stay just one more night. That evening, I found something new near the arroyo. A cairn. A pile of stones stacked too perfectly to be natural. Each rock was smooth, rounded, and balanced with eerie precision. In the center, someone or something had placed a tortoise shell, bleached white, cracked in half. Its edges were smeared with something dark. I backed away slowly and returned to camp, my mouth dry and heart racing. That night, I heard it again. Not clicking this time. Scraping, like bone on metal. It came from just outside the tent. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The scraping continued for a minute, then stopped. I sat frozen until dawn. When I stepped out, the tent flap was torn. A long gash from top to bottom. The solar panel had been smashed and one of the supply crates overturned. I found more tracks, dozens of them, circling the tent. Some clawed, some hoofed. Others I couldn't tell, too strange, almost like hands. That morning I packed everything as fast as I could and started driving out. I didn't stop to log burrows or check the cameras. I just wanted to get back to the service road. But as I drove, I noticed something chilling. Every few miles along the edge of the dirt road, there were cairns, just like the one near the arroyo, perfectly stacked, increasing in size. One of them had a coyote skull balanced on top. Another had a lizard's tail hanging from a rock. They hadn't been there before. I would have seen them. The final cairn, placed at the last curve before rejoining the main road, held something that made me slam the brakes. It was my wildlife camera. Smashed. Twisted. Placed like an offering. I didn't stop. I didn't get out. I drove all the way back to Gila Bend and didn't look in the rearview mirror once. When I finally reached cell service, I called the department. They claimed the satellite radio had malfunctioned due to solar flare interference, and when I tried to explain what I'd seen, they dismissed it as stress-induced hallucination. Heat stroke. Isolation. Standard cover-up jargon. I sent the photos of the tracks. The cairns. No response. Later, when I reviewed my notes and photos again at home, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. In one of the first shots, an innocent photo of a tortoise burrow, I could just barely make out a shape in the distance. Blurry, almost transparent, like something hiding behind the heat shimmer. It was tall, thin, head cocked sideways. I haven't gone back to the desert since. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I hear the click, the scrape, I smell the dust, feel the weight of that still air. People say the desert is empty, that it's barren. They're wrong. There's something out there, watching, waiting, and it does not want to be found. Story, the end. The sun was just beginning its slow descent behind the jagged ridges of the Mojave Desert as Jake and his friend Mike pulled their beat-up Chevy onto the narrow dirt road that led toward the old mining town of Rhyolite. The town had been abandoned for nearly a century, but the lure of exploring a ghost town had pulled them here. Jake was a freelance photographer, always chasing the perfect shot, and Mike, a history buff, was eager to see firsthand the place where so many had once sought fortune and found ruin instead. They'd left Las Vegas that afternoon, fueled by caffeine and a restless energy that came with young men chasing adventure. Their plan was simple. Arrive before dark, set up camp near the ruins, and shoot some long-exposure photos of the eerie desert sky illuminated by the stars. The desert air was dry, almost brittle, and it carried a stillness that was unsettling in its way. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, even the usual desert creatures seemed to have vanished. The landscape stretched endless, sand and rock fractured by scattered, brittle brush. As they drove, Jake cracked open a window to let in the dry air, and he noticed the silence pressing in on them. Mike tried to joke about it, but even his voice sounded hollow. When they arrived, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows that twisted around the rusted remnants of old mining equipment. The skeletal frames of buildings stood like giant sentinels against the dying light. Mike pulled the truck into what had once been the town's main street, now just a broad stretch of cracked earth littered with broken glass and rusted cans. Jake grabbed his camera and tripod, adjusting the lens to capture the fading light. Mike wandered toward the remains of the old saloon, pushing the door open with a groan. The interior smelled of dust and decay. "We should be careful," Jake called out. "These places can be unstable." Mike laughed nervously. "Come on, man, it's just an old building." The sun was nearly gone, and Jake was finishing a shot when he noticed something strange. At the edge of the town, near the hills, a faint flicker of light appeared, like a lantern or a fire. It moved, small and distant, almost like a glowworm in the dark. "Mike, do you see that?" Jake asked, pointing. Mike squinted. "Probably a campfire, or a hunter, maybe." "No one hunts out here anymore," Jake said, uneasy. "We're miles from anything." They decided to investigate, thinking it might be other travelers. They grabbed their flashlights and headed toward the flicker, the cool desert night wrapping around them like a blanket. The flicker disappeared suddenly, and in its place was an oppressive silence. No wind stirred, no sounds from the desert at all. Jake's stomach twisted. Maybe we should turn back. But Mike pressed on, curiosity pushing him forward. They reached the edge of the small ridge overlooking the valley, and Jake saw something that made his blood run cold. There, in the hollow below, was a circle of figures, maybe 8 or 9, standing around a fire. They were dressed in tattered clothes that looked decades old, and their faces were turned away from the firelight, but Jake could see their outlines, thin, almost skeletal. The firelight flickered against their faces, revealing hollow eyes and pale skin, like something not quite human. Mike whispered, "Who are they?" Jake felt a wave of dread wash over him. He raised his camera, but as soon as the lens pointed at the figures, the fire snapped out, gone in an instant, leaving only the deep, suffocating darkness. The figures vanished. "Let's get the hell out of here," Jake said, voice trembling. They hurried back to the truck, but as they scrambled up the ridge, Mike stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" Jake stopped too. At first, nothing. Then a faint whispering just beyond the ridge, unintelligible but chilling. The wind carried faint words like chanting. They reached the truck and locked the doors, engines roaring to life as Jake tried to calm himself. As they drove back toward the highway, the whispering seemed to follow, fading only as the first streetlights of civilization appeared. They vowed never to return. But that night, Jake couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the image of those figures, their hollow eyes burning into him. He pulled out his camera and reviewed the photos from earlier. The ruins, the sky, and then, at the very end, a single frame he hadn't taken intentionally. A close-up of a pale face with blackened eyes staring directly into the lens. Jake tried to delete it, but the image remained, searing itself into his memory. Weeks later, Jake found himself drawn back to Rhyolite, this time alone. Something compelled him, a mixture of fear and fascination. The desert was vast, but he felt watched. At dusk, he wandered the town, the ruins now casting long shadows under the starry sky. A soft voice called his name, barely audible over the wind. Jake spun, but no one was there. The silence was heavier now, more suffocating. He reached the old church on the edge of town. The door creaked open as he pushed it. revealing darkness inside. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. His breath fogged in the cold air. As his flashlight swept across the pews, he saw scratch marks on the walls, like desperate clawing. Then, from the corner, a figure emerged, translucent, almost shimmering in the faint light. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered dress, her face streaked with dirt and tears, eyes hollow and filled with despair. Jake froze. She spoke, voice like the desert wind. "Leave, before it's too late." Before he could react, the church door slammed shut behind him, plunging him into darkness. The temperature plummeted further. Jake felt icy hands grasp his shoulders, pulling him backward. He struggled, heart pounding in his chest, but the hands were relentless, dragging him toward the altar. Suddenly, light flooded the room. The woman was gone. The door creaked open again. Jake bolted outside, gasping for air. He fled the town and didn't stop until the bright lights of Las Vegas were far behind. Back home, Jake's nightmares worsened. He saw the faces of the dead, heard their whispers in the wind. The desert had marked him, and no matter how far he went, he could never escape the haunting emptiness that clung to his soul. Story the end. The desert wasn't supposed to be this unforgiving, at least not according to the maps and the weather reports. When John and Mike set out early that morning, their plan was simple. A day hike through the Mojave Desert, ending with a late afternoon drive back to Las Vegas. John was an amateur photographer chasing the perfect shot of the desert's golden light, and Mike was his longtime friend, mostly there to keep company and share stories. They both loved the desert's quiet beauty, and this trip was meant to be a break from their hectic lives in the city. The sky was clear, the sun bright, but not yet scorching, when they pulled off the highway onto a dusty dirt road leading toward an old abandoned mining site Mike had read about online. It was supposed to be a hidden gem for photographers and explorers, far enough from the main tourist trails to feel remote, but not so far as to be dangerous. At least, that's what they told themselves. They parked near some rusted-out equipment and began their hike just after 9 a.m. The air was dry, the wind carrying a faint grit that coated their skin and gear. John was eager, snapping pictures of wildflowers and the jagged rock formations that rose like broken teeth against the horizon. Mike, a little less enthusiastic about the photography side of things, stayed close behind, occasionally pointing out some wildlife or remarking on the silence. Around noon, they reached the ruins of an old cabin, barely standing but still showing signs of life decades ago. John spotted a cool shadow beneath the porch and suggested they take a break there. As they sat down, the temperature began climbing rapidly, and the sun burned hotter. They drank water, joked about how the desert was trying to test their survival skills, and started joking about urban legends they'd heard, the cursed miner, the lost prospector, things that gave the desert an eerie reputation. Neither of them believed in ghost stories. They had grown up in Nevada, where desert myths were common, but the desert was just a place, harsh and beautiful, but not haunted. After the break, they pushed further toward a rocky ridge where the view was supposed to be spectacular. That's when things started to go wrong. Mike spotted a faint trail branching off the main path, almost hidden under a wash of gravel and sand. He pointed it out to John, and curiosity took over. The trail was narrow, winding down into a shallow canyon that didn't show on their map. They decided to explore, eager to find some untouched spot for photos. The canyon walls rose steep and rough on either side, blocking most of the sun and creating an odd, cold shadow. It was a relief from the heat, but the silence deepened unnervingly. John took photos of the strange rock formations, while Mike tried to keep spirits high, humming a tune and cracking jokes. About 30 minutes in, John's foot hit something hard buried beneath the sand. He crouched down and began brushing dirt away. To his surprise, it was a rusted metal box, partially open. The box looked like a toolbox, old and worn, with faded lettering. Mike was hesitant, but curious. Could be something left behind by miners, maybe tools or supplies. John carefully opened it further and found a stack of yellowed papers tied with a leather string, along with some small metallic objects that looked like old keys or parts of machinery. John grabbed the papers and began unfolding one. It was a journal entry, dated back to the 1930s. The handwriting was shaky but legible. It spoke of hardship and strange noises heard in the desert nights, strange shadows that moved beyond campfires, and warnings about the black-eyed men who came with the darkness. Mike scoffed. Ghost stories. Typical desert nonsense. John, still intrigued, flipped through the journal. One entry mentioned a lost prospector who disappeared near the canyon, last seen following a trail into the rocks. The journal warned others not to trust the desert when the sun dipped below the horizon. The temperature was already dropping, and the sun was sinking fast behind the ridge. They decided to turn back, but when they retraced their steps, something felt off. The trail they'd taken seemed altered. The rocks shifted in ways that made the path confusing. The canyon's shadows grew longer and darker, swallowing the daylight quickly. Mike started looking around nervously. Didn't this canyon look different going in, like the rocks weren't piled up like that? John nodded, feeling the same. The path wasn't as clear, and the narrow walls seemed to press in tighter. They tried calling out to each other, but their voices echoed oddly, distorted by the rocks. They walked slower, trying to recognize landmarks, but the canyon seemed to twist unnaturally. John pulled out his phone for GPS, but there was no signal. Great, Mike muttered. No cell, no way out. Panic was starting to bubble under their calm exteriors. The temperature dropped suddenly, the desert night creeping in fast. The wind picked up, carrying a faint whisper that neither could place, like distant voices or sighs. Mike shined his flashlight down the path, but the beam flickered as if the batteries were failing. John's camera flashed on and off with similar glitches. Shadows danced on the canyon walls, shifting shapes that looked almost like figures watching them. Mike's voice cracked. John, did you see that? Over there? John turned his light toward a dark shape at the edge of the canyon. For a second, he thought he saw a man standing motionless, staring directly at them with deep black eyes. Then the figure vanished. Probably a trick of the light, John said, though his voice was shaky. They quickened their pace, but the trail kept leading them in circles. Desperation set in. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time warped in the canyon's darkness. They could hear footsteps behind them, but when they turned, no one was there. The black-eyed figure appeared again, this time closer, always just out of reach. Mike's breathing grew ragged. We need to get out. Now. John agreed, but the canyon's walls seemed to stretch endlessly. Every time they picked a direction, it led them deeper into the maze. Eventually, they came to a wide opening, a small cave at the base of the ridge. They decided to take shelter inside for the night, hoping the morning light would help them find their way. Inside the cave, the air was cold and stale. John set his flashlight on the ground while Mike tried to build a small fire from dry brush. The flames sputtered weakly, casting flickering shadows on the cave walls. As the fire glowed, the shadows seemed to move on their own, growing into grotesque shapes that twisted and pulsed. Both men sat frozen, watching the darkness pulse like a living thing. Then, faint voices began whispering from the cave's depths, speaking in a language neither understood, full of sorrow and menace. John's heart pounded. He reached for his camera to record the sounds, hoping to prove they were hallucinating or hearing echoes, but the camera died again. Mike gripped John's arm. We're not alone. We have to get out, before. Suddenly, the fire died. The cave plunged into absolute darkness, and a cold breath swept over them like icy fingers brushing their skin. The black-eyed figure appeared at the cave's entrance, blocking their escape. John and Mike froze in terror, unable to move or speak, as the figure's eyes seemed to bore into their souls. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the figure disappeared, leaving the cave cold and silent. At dawn, the desert light spilled into the cave. John and Mike wasted no time. They scrambled out, scanning the landscape for familiar landmarks. The desert, now harsh and unforgiving in the morning sun, revealed the path back. They recognized the rusted equipment near their car and ran toward it. Back in the safety of their vehicle, John called for help and reported their location. But when rescue arrived, the canyon and the cave were empty and silent. John later submitted the journal pages and the photographs he'd taken, but the images only showed blurred shadows and distorted light. Neither man spoke much about the black-eyed figure or the whispering voices, but the desert had left its mark. They never returned, and no one else was ever able to find that lost canyon. The desert, vast and ancient, keeps its secrets well, and sometimes It takes those who wander too far into its heart. Story, the end. The desert is a place that demands respect. It offers no mercy, no second chances. I learned that the hard way. My name is Mark, and this is what happened to me in the Arizona desert, something that I still can't fully explain. It started with a job. I was a geologist working for a small environmental consulting firm based in Phoenix. The kind of work that out in the field a lot, sampling soil, analyzing mineral deposits, mapping terrain. Usually it was routine, day trips, some hiking, collecting data. But this project was different. I was sent out to investigate an abandoned mining site near the Sonoran Desert, close to a place called the New River area, about 30 miles north of the city. The company had received reports of unusual contamination in the groundwater, and they wanted samples from the source. It was late April, the kind of heat that had just started to set in, dry and sharp without the brutal peak of summer. I packed my gear the night before, a GPS, water bottles, soil testing kits, my old backpack, and a pistol for safety. You never know what you might encounter in the desert. Wild animals, or worse, people with bad intentions. I drove out early the next morning, leaving Phoenix before sunrise. The roads were empty, the sky turning a pale shade of pink as I headed north on I-17. After about an hour, I took the exit toward New River and then onto a dusty, unpaved road that wound into the desert hills. The landscape was stunning in its starkness: cactus clusters, scrub brush, red rocks bathed in the golden morning light. My plan was to set up a temporary camp near the mine entrance, collect water and soil samples, and head back by nightfall. I knew the area had been mined in the early 1900s and then abandoned, but local rumors talked about strange occurrences, voices on the wind, people disappearing. I dismissed those as old tales meant to scare tourists. Around 9 a.m., I arrived at the site. The mine was partially collapsed, its wooden beams rotted and half buried in sand. I set up my camp nearby, careful to stay away from unstable rock formations. The air was hot but breathable, and the wind was calm. I spent the next few hours collecting samples. The ground around the mine was cracked and dry, but there were traces of damp soil near a small wash, a dried-up creek bed. As I worked, I noticed strange markings on the rocks, symbols carved deep into the stone. They looked like a mix of Native American petroglyphs and something else, more angular and modern. I took photos but couldn't make sense of them. After lunch, I decided to explore the area further, hoping to find other water sources or signs of contamination upstream. I followed the wash eastward, climbing over rocks and keeping an eye on the GPS. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional call of a hawk overhead. About 2 miles from the mine, I spotted an old, rusted pickup truck half buried in sand. The license plate was faded beyond recognition, but inside the cab I found a tattered notebook, pages yellowed with age. Flipping through it, I recognized it as a diary. Handwritten notes, mostly about mining operations, weather, and strange noises at night. The last entry was dated 50 years ago and ended abruptly. That's when I first felt it, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The air grew thick and heavy. The sky seemed to darken even though it was early afternoon. The wind picked up suddenly, whipping dust into my face. I looked around. Nothing was there, just the barren desert. But I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. I packed the notebook carefully and hurried back toward my camp. On the way, I heard a faint sound, like a distant whisper carried by the wind. I stopped and listened, but it faded away. Back at camp, I checked my gear and prepared to leave. I had enough samples and data, and the sun was starting to dip. But as I loaded the Jeep, I noticed something strange. The dirt around the truck and mine had fresh footprints. Large, uneven prints that didn't match any boot I owned. They led from the mine into the desert, toward the east. Curious and uneasy, I grabbed my flashlight and followed them. The sun was setting fast, and shadows stretched long across the sand. The footprints were irregular, some deep, some barely visible, as if the creature dragging its feet or moving unevenly. About half a mile from the mine, I stopped near a rocky outcrop. The footprints ended abruptly. I shone my flashlight into the shadows, but saw nothing. Then I heard it, a guttural growl, low and distant. It echoed through the canyons like a warning. I froze. For a moment, I considered turning back, but something compelled me to keep moving. I called out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer, just the wind. Suddenly, a cold breeze rushed past me, carrying a foul odor, rotting flesh mixed with something metallic. I turned sharply and saw it. Standing about 20 yards away, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, gaunt shape covered in dust and tattered clothes, its face obscured by a filthy cloth. Its eyes glowed faintly in the beam of my flashlight, a sickly yellow. I stumbled back, heart pounding. The creature made no sound but raised a bony hand slowly, pointing toward the mine. I ran. Back at the Jeep, I slammed the door shut, locked it, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the growing darkness. As I drove off, I caught one last glimpse of the figure standing at the edge of the wash, watching me leave. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's glowing eyes staring back. The next day, I went back with a local guide, an older man named Tom who knew the desert well. When I showed him the diary and told him what I'd seen, he grew pale. "That area," he said quietly, "used to be a mining town, abandoned decades ago after a series of disappearances. Folks around here say something got into the water, a sickness. People went mad, some vanished. We call it the ghost of New River." I laughed nervously, but Tom's expression was serious. "Some say the desert itself claims those who don't belong. You got lucky, most don't come back. I never went back after that. The samples confirmed some contamination, but the company dropped the project quietly. Sometimes I wonder what that thing was. A man-turned monster? Some desert spirit? Or just a hallucination born of heat and stress? Whatever it was, it's still out there, lurking in the shadows of the Arizona desert." Story the end. The desert had always been a place I was drawn to, even if it was a little strange to most people. I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, so the vast stretches of sand and scrub were familiar, even comforting in a way. But I never imagined how quickly that comfort could turn into something else, something deeply unsettling. My story starts in the summer of 2017, when I decided to take a solo trip out to Joshua Tree National Park for a few days of camping and hiking. I'd been burnt out by work. I was a graphic designer working late hours, stuck in a cubicle, and I needed some silence, some space. Joshua Tree was perfect, remote enough to escape, but close enough to civilization to feel safe. I packed my truck with supplies, plenty of water, camping gear, my phone, though reception was spotty, and a portable charger. I figured a few days alone in the desert would clear my head. I arrived late afternoon on a Friday, pulling into a small campsite tucked away from the main roads. It was one of those primitive sites. No electricity, no running water, just a dirt clearing with a fire ring. The sun was beating down, and the desert heat pressed against the truck as I set up my tent and arranged my gear. I could hear the distant calls of birds and the wind ruffling through the Joshua trees. After setting up, I grabbed my backpack and decided to explore a little before the sun fully set. I picked a trail marked on the park map called Lost Palms Oasis. It was supposed to be a moderate 3-mile hike, leading to a rare desert oasis with a cluster of palm trees and a small water source. That sounded perfect. The trail was quiet except for the crunch of my boots on sand and stone. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows, and the air was drying out rapidly. I felt a strange stillness in the desert that day, the kind that almost feels like the world is holding its breath. About halfway through the hike, the trail split unexpectedly. The map showed one main path, but there was a smaller, less defined fork veering off to the left. I figured it might be a shortcut or an alternate route to the oasis, so I took it, thinking I'd save some time. I walked for about 15 minutes, the sun sinking lower and the air cooling rapidly. Suddenly, the trail disappeared. No more footprints, no more markers, just open scrub and cracked earth. I stopped, trying to get my bearings. My phone had no signal. I pulled out the paper map, but it was starting to get dark, and the fading light made the creases in the paper impossible to read. I felt a knot in my stomach. I'd gotten turned around. I decided to turn back, but as I retraced my steps, something caught my eye. A small figure, sitting just off the path, barely visible in the shadows of a Joshua tree. I squinted but couldn't make it out clearly. As I approached, the figure shifted. It was a man. He looked thin and dirty, wearing ragged clothes and a hat that shaded his face. His eyes were wide and dark, and he didn't speak. "Hey," I said cautiously, "are you okay?" He didn't respond, just stared at me, unmoving. Something about him made me uneasy. His skin looked almost gray under the fading light, and his breathing was shallow. I tried again. "Do you need help?" Still no answer. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shook his head. Slowly, he got up and began walking away without a word. I watched him disappear into the brush. That should have been the end of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. I headed back toward the main trail, but the desert seemed different now. Darker, quieter. The birds had stopped singing. The wind was still. Suddenly, I heard a faint tapping sound behind me. I spun around, flashlight flicking on, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was just a rock falling or some dry branch cracking. But the tapping came again, rhythmically, like footsteps, but not quite right. They were too light, too uneven. I picked up my pace, moving briskly down the path, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I saw the man again, standing about 50 yards ahead at the edge of the path. His head tilted unnaturally to the side. He didn't move, just stared. I swallowed hard and tried to keep my voice steady. "Hey, do you need help?" This time he took a step forward, and I realized something was very wrong. His legs moved backward at the knee, almost like a bird's, giving him a loping, jerky gait. His arms hung limp and long, and his skin was pallid, almost translucent under my flashlight. I started back away slowly, trying to put distance between us. He followed, not at a run, but a steady, relentless pace. I broke into a run, heart hammering. My flashlight bobbed wildly as I sprinted down the trail. I heard the tapping behind me again, closer this time. The air felt colder, the silence heavier. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the trees onto an open plain. The moon was rising, casting silvery light over the cracked earth. I looked back. The man was gone. I didn't stop running until I saw my truck's headlights in the distance. When I finally climbed in and locked the doors, I sat there gasping for breath, trying to process what I'd seen. I called the park rangers the next day to report the man. They told me no one had reported missing persons matching the description, and no one lived or camped near the spot I described. The rangers also warned me about a local legend, stories from old desert dwellers about the Lurker, a creature that haunted Joshua Tree and the surrounding deserts, said to prey on lost travelers. I laughed it off at the time, but the memory of that man, or whatever he was, has never left me. Since then, I've heard scratching on my windows at night, seen strange shadows darting just beyond my vision, and felt a cold presence watching me whenever I'm near the desert. I never went back to Joshua Tree, and I don't think I ever will. Story the end. The desert isn't a place you just wander into without respect. I learned that the hard way. I'm not some thrill seeker or paranormal nut. I'm a geologist. I spend my days looking for mineral deposits and studying rock formations, usually out in remote, arid places. I had a contract to survey a stretch of desert land near the Arizona-New Mexico border, part of a proposed site for a solar farm. The place was remote, with little to no cell reception, and a blistering sun that made you think twice about taking off your hat. It was late May when I arrived, and the heat was already brutal, even in the early mornings. My team was small, me, a field assistant named Carl, and a driver who doubled as security, Ron. The company had warned us to be cautious. There had been reports from locals about strange occurrences and disappearances in the area, but no one took it seriously. I was focused on the science and the work. Superstition didn't have a place in my line of thinking. The first day we set out early, driving dusty, uneven tracks carved out years ago by off-road vehicles and cattle herds. The terrain was unforgiving, scattered with mesquite bushes, brittle yucca, and the occasional gnarled Joshua tree. We took GPS readings, mapped soil samples, and documented geological layers. Everything was normal, if you can call the endless monotony of sand and rock normal. On the second day, as we ventured farther from our base camp, Carl noticed a structure in the distance, an old shack, half collapsed and leaning precariously to one side. It wasn't on any of our maps. I decided to check it out, curious if it could be some forgotten homestead or mining relic. We approached slowly, boots crunching on the gravelly dirt. The shack was weathered wood, bleached by the sun, with rusted corrugated metal roofing. The door hung open on one hinge. Inside, dust motes floated in the shafts of light piercing the slats. Broken glass from a shattered window lay scattered on the floor, mixed with dried animal droppings. The smell was faint but sour. Something had died here long ago. Carl spotted a faded newspaper pinned to the inside wall with a rusty nail. The headline was barely legible: "Local miner vanishes near dry lakes." The date was from 1947. I shivered, even though the air was hot. There was a leather-bound notebook on a makeshift table, covered in dirt and grime. I opened it carefully, flipping through pages filled with cramped handwriting. It seemed to be a journal kept by someone named Henry Markham, a prospector who had been searching for silver veins in the area. The last entry was hurried and frantic. May 13th, 1947. They watch from the rocks. The desert whispers in the night. I hear them close. If you find this, do not come here. The pit is hungry. A pit? I frowned and looked out the window, scanning the rocky terrain beyond the shack. There was no obvious depression, just rolling sand dunes and scattered boulders. I pocketed the journal and we hurried back to camp. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the tent poles and whipping the desert sand into little storms. I couldn't sleep. The words from Henry's journal kept echoing in my head. What did he mean? The pit is hungry. I joked with Carl and Ron the next morning, trying to shake it off, but they were quieter than usual. On the third day, we moved deeper into the desert, following GPS coordinates that took us toward a cluster of mesas marked on older topographical maps. The heat was oppressive, and the silence around us was thick. No birds, no animals, just the occasional groan of wind through the rocks. As we climbed one of the mesas, Carl suddenly stopped, pointing to a dark patch in the sand near a rocky outcrop. "It's a hole," he said, approaching carefully. It was a large sinkhole, maybe 20 feet across, with steep sides that dropped into shadow. The air near the edge was cooler, almost moist. I scanned the walls with my flashlight. The hole was deep, too deep to see the bottom. There were no obvious signs of recent disturbance, no footprints or tire tracks. We set up camp nearby, deciding to investigate the hole more thoroughly in the morning. That night, the desert whispered. I swear the wind wasn't just moving sand, but voices. At first, it was barely audible, a faint hiss, like breath on the back of your neck. Then it grew louder, a low, guttural chanting that seemed to come from the pit itself. Ron was the first to say he heard it too. "We should get out of here," he said, his voice low and tense. But Carl and I were curious. We rappelled down into the pit at dawn. The walls were smooth stone, like they'd been carved, not natural. As we descended, the temperature dropped, the air growing damp and heavy. About halfway down, I spotted carvings on the walls, strange symbols, half erased by time but unmistakably deliberate. Carl snapped photos while I searched for signs of anything unusual. At the bottom, we found a cavern large enough to stand in, lit faintly by shafts of light filtering from the opening above. But there was something else, a pit within the cavern, filled with black, viscous liquid. I reached out with a stick to test it. The liquid rippled unnaturally, as if alive. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from the darkness beyond. We froze. "Something's here," Carl whispered. I shone my flashlight into the shadows, but saw nothing. Then, the growl became a shriek, piercing and inhuman. We scrambled up the walls, adrenaline surging. As we neared the surface, the rope above us jerked violently, as if someone or something was grabbing it. We broke the surface, gasping for air, and tore back to camp without a word. That night, I barely slept. The wind was louder, the voices clearer. I could swear they were chanting. At dawn, the truck was gone. No keys, no engine sounds, just the empty camp and the swaying tent. Panic surged through me. I called out for Ron and Carl, but got no response. The journal was still in my pack. I flipped to the last page again and a new entry appeared, handwritten, though I hadn't written it. "Leave now. They take the ones who listen." My phone blinked with a message from an unknown number. "Don't stay. The desert remembers." I packed my things and started walking. The sun was merciless, my water dwindling. I had no idea which direction to go. Hours passed, the heat burning my throat and skin. I collapsed near a cluster of rocks, eyes closing. When I opened them, the desert had changed. The landscape stretched unnaturally wide, the sky a sickly orange hue. The sun hung low, though it was mid-afternoon. Shadows moved against logic. Shapes flickered at the edge of my vision, tall, thin figures with elongated limbs. They didn't speak, but watched with eyes that burned like coals. I tried to run, but the sand shifted beneath me, pulling me back. I screamed for help, but the voices only grew louder, chanting in a language older than the land. Days passed. or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. Time lost meaning. I was trapped in that desert nightmare, haunted by unseen watchers. Eventually, I was found by a passing ranger, wandering half-mad and dehydrated. They sent me to the hospital. When I recovered, I tried to tell my story, but without evidence, no one believed me. The journal was gone from my pack. My photos were corrupted, and the GPS coordinates I gave the authorities led only to endless, empty desert. But I know what I saw. The desert is alive, it watches, it waits, and it never forgets. Story the end. The desert has a way of making you feel invisible. Vast, empty, endless. It's not just the heat or the sand, but the silence. A silence so complete it presses in on you like a physical weight. I learned that the hard way, out near the Mojave in the summer of 2017. I was on a solo hiking trip, something I'd done a few times before to clear my head. This time I chose an old route off the beaten path, part of a mapped trail that most people avoid because it was rough and remote. I wanted solitude, and that's exactly what I got. I started at dawn, my pack loaded with water, supplies, and a satellite phone just in case. The first day was uneventful. Heat was brutal, but manageable with early starts and long breaks in the shade of Joshua trees and scattered boulders. I camped near a dry creek bed and slept under the stars, no problems. That night, the desert was loud in its own way, wind picking up, the distant caws of ravens, coyotes calling in the dark. I drifted off around 11 p.m., lulled by the natural rhythms. Around 2 a.m., I woke suddenly. At first, I thought it was the wind again, but then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my tent. Not the crunch of animal paws, but the heavier tread of boots or shoes. I froze. The desert was supposed to be empty. The nearest road was miles away, and I hadn't seen another person in 2 days. I tried to rationalize. Maybe another hiker, but who hikes in the middle of the night? I kept the flashlight close, but didn't dare unzip the tent. The footsteps stopped, then started again, moving away. The next morning, I packed up and kept moving, telling myself it was a prank or someone lost, but the feeling of being watched lingered. 2 days later, I stumbled onto a small abandoned mining camp. The place was run down, rusted equipment, old cans, a collapsed shack. I was curious and wandered around carefully. That's when I saw it. Symbols scratched into a wooden post, strange lines and shapes I couldn't decipher. Nearby, the bones of a small animal lay bleached white. That night, as I camped near the ruins, I heard voices. Not clear words, but murmurs. Faint, almost hypnotic, coming from the direction of the mining shack. I thought it might be the wind whistling through the broken wood. I told myself to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next day, I decided to cut the trip short. I was about halfway through my route and wanted to get back to civilization. But as I started packing, I realized my water supply was down to half, more than I expected for the last 2 days. I double-checked my bottles. Everything seemed normal, but something felt off. Later that afternoon, while crossing a stretch of open sand, I noticed footprints. Not mine. Larger boot prints heading toward where I'd camped the night before. They looked fresh, and the spacing was uneven, as if whoever made them was limping or dragging something. I froze. I wasn't alone out here. My heart pounded. I scanned the horizon, but saw nothing. Then, from the edge of the ruins, a figure appeared. Tall, thin, wrapped in a dust-covered poncho. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed their face. They didn't speak, but gestured for me to follow. I didn't want to. I yelled, told them I was leaving. They just nodded, then turned and started walking toward a ridge. Something about their movements was unnatural, jerky, almost mechanical. Against my better judgment, I followed. I felt like I had no choice. As we climbed, the sun sank low. The temperature dropped quickly. When we reached the top, the figure stopped in front of a shallow pit dug into the sand. Inside, a pile of bones, human bones. My stomach twisted. The figure pointed at the bones, then back at me, then down the ridge. I understood. Get out. Suddenly, the figure dropped the poncho, revealing a gaunt, pale face with sunken eyes. They smiled, a cold, dead smile. I stumbled back, tripped, and scrambled down the ridge as fast as I could. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, parked miles away at the trailhead. My hands shook as I locked the doors and started the engine. On the drive back, I called the local ranger station. I told them what I'd seen, asked if anyone was missing, or if there were warnings about the area. The dispatcher said the mining camp was known for disappearances decades ago. The land was supposed to be off limits due to unstable ground, but no one patrolled regularly. When I got back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. That night, I found muddy footprints circling my car at the motel. No explanation, no signs of forced entry. I left the next morning and never went back to the desert. I still get dreams about that figure, standing on the ridge, silent but watching. The desert is a place of beauty and danger, but sometimes it holds things that don't want to be disturbed. I learned that the hard way. Story the end. It was the summer of 2017 when I first learned just how unforgiving the desert could be. I'm from New Mexico originally, and having grown up near Albuquerque, I was no stranger to dry heat or vast empty spaces. But this was different. What happened to me that summer changed everything I thought I knew about those endless sandy plains and rocky outcrops. I was 29, working as a freelance geologist, mostly doing contract jobs for oil companies and occasionally for state survey projects. That year, I landed a short-term gig for a private company that wanted to survey a remote stretch of desert land near the Arizona-California border, close to the vast Sonoran Desert. The contract was straightforward: map mineral deposits and gather soil samples over about 30 square miles. Nothing too complicated, or so I thought. They sent me a rusty old Jeep and a satellite phone with a satellite GPS unit bolted on the dashboard. The first few days were uneventful. The area was barren, harsh, and suffocating under the intense sun. During the day, I'd sweat through my clothes and drink liter after liter of water, hoping not to dehydrate. Nights were freezing cold, and I was grateful for the thin sleeping bag I brought. On the third day, as I was taking soil samples near an ancient dry riverbed, I noticed some strange markings on the rocks. They looked almost like petroglyphs, but I wasn't an expert in archaeology, so I didn't think much of it. The symbols were dark and jagged, etched deeply into the sandstone, and they seemed to form a pattern I couldn't decipher. That night, as I camped near the site, I heard something move outside my tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote or some kind of desert rodent, but the sound was too deliberate, sat like footsteps, slow and dragging. I unzipped the tent flap carefully and shone my flashlight around. The desert stretched out, bathed in moonlight, and I saw nothing but rocks and cactus. I convinced myself it was just the wind shifting the sand. The next day, I found fresh footprints leading from my campsite toward the riverbed. They were large, almost twice the size of a man's, with long toes splayed wide. I hadn't seen anyone else in days, and the footprints didn't match mine or any animals I knew. The prints disappeared into a cluster of boulders. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my gear and headed toward the rocks. The sun was climbing high when I reached the boulders. The air was still, unnervingly so. As I moved closer, I noticed more of the strange markings carved into the stones. This time, I took pictures with my phone and some close-up shots of the symbols. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. The hairs on my arms stood up despite the heat. I turned around and saw a figure standing about 50 yards away at the edge of the clearing. It was a man, or what looked like a man. He wore tattered, dusty clothes, and his skin was sunburned and cracked like old leather. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, but he was watching me. I felt exposed and frozen. "Hey," I called out, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away. Not running, but with a purposeful stride. Something about him was wrong. He moved like he didn't fully belong to this world. I debated whether to follow him or get back to my Jeep. I chose the latter. When I reached my vehicle, I locked the doors and sat inside, heart pounding. That night, the footsteps came again, louder and closer. I wasn't going to get out of the tent to check. I sat in the Jeep, listening to the dry wind, the occasional scratching against the metal sides, the sound of footsteps pacing just outside my little camp. I called the company the next day, asked if they had anyone else out there. They said no. The area was supposed to be uninhabited. Something was off. On the fifth day, I woke up to my water supply being drained. The bottles were on the ground outside the Jeep, empty and knocked over. I'd left them inside the vehicle, securely closed. I took that as a warning. I packed up quickly and decided to head back early. But as I started the Jeep and put it in gear, the GPS went haywire. The screen flickered, showing erratic movements and the satellite phone lost signal entirely. I was stranded. I thought about walking out, but I knew the desert was no place for that. I sat in the vehicle, rationed my remaining water, and waited. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed a faint glow coming from the direction of the boulders, a flickering orange light, like a fire. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and approached. I found the man from before sitting cross-legged near a small fire, his face illuminated by the flames. Around him were strange objects, animal bones, feathers, and more carved stones. He looked up as I approached, but said nothing. His lips moved silently, like chanting. The firelight cast long shadows, and I could see the symbols on the stones glowing faintly. Suddenly, the wind picked up and the chanting grew louder in my head. It wasn't coming from him, but inside me. I staggered back to the Jeep, heart racing. The next morning, the strange man was gone. So were my supplies. The Jeep wouldn't start. I was trapped. I walked. Days passed, my mind fraying from thirst and exhaustion. At some point, I began to see figures in the distance, shapes moving just beyond the horizon, always watching. I'd try to approach, but they vanished into the heat waves. On the 7th day, I stumbled onto a hidden cavern. Inside, the walls were covered with the same strange carvings, but they glowed with an eerie blue light. I heard whispers. Then a voice spoke, clear and cold. "You belong here now." I collapsed. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital in Phoenix. They said I'd been found wandering the desert, dehydrated and delirious. I told them about the man, the carvings, the voices. They said I was lucky to be alive. But I knew the truth. The desert never lets you go once it decides you belong. Story, the end. The sun beat down mercilessly on the endless stretches of cracked earth, the kind of heat that seemed to shimmer and dance just above the barren ground. This was the Mojave Desert, the kind of place where legends are born, not from grand battles or ancient kings, but from the quiet, insidious ways the desert claims its victims. I know this because I almost became one of them. My name is Tom, and I'm a geologist. Back in the summer of 2014, I was sent out on a week-long field study, mapping mineral deposits in a particularly remote part of the Mojave near the Nevada-California border. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just long days under the sun, occasional rattlesnakes, and maybe a few scorpions. But the desert had other plans. The trip started smoothly enough. I rented a beat-up Jeep, packed enough water to drown a small town, and headed out along a rarely traveled dirt road leading to a dry lake bed. My satellite phone was my lifeline. Out here, cell coverage was non-existent. I was alone as planned, a solitary figure surrounded by an unbroken sea of sand and scrub. On the 2nd day, the weather turned strangely ominous. The sun disappeared behind a haze, the kind of dusty veil that turns everything yellow and dull. The temperature dropped suddenly, enough that I had to pull on a jacket, which felt surreal in the middle of July. I chalked it up to a sandstorm brewing and decided to take shelter behind a large rock formation near my camp. That's when I noticed it. Footprints. Not just any footprints, but oddly shaped ones, larger than any man's and spaced unevenly. They weren't fresh, but weren't old either. They led away from my camp toward the east, toward the open desert. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I followed the trail cautiously, flashlight in hand, but the prints disappeared near a series of jagged rocks called the Devil's Teeth. I climbed one of the formations and scanned the horizon, but saw nothing but desert. That night, my radio crackled to life for the first time in hours. A voice, faint, distorted, came through. It wasn't a distress call, but more like a warning. "Don't wander," the voice hissed. "Stay, or be claimed." I tried to respond, but static swallowed my words. The next morning, I found my water supply partially drained. Not by me, someone or something had taken it. Panic crept in, but I told myself I was imagining things. On the 4th day, the Jeep sputtered and died. I was stranded miles from any highway, no water, no signal. I settled in to wait for help, but as night fell, I heard whispers. Low, unintelligible, carried by the dry wind. Then the footsteps came again, circling my camp like a predator stalking prey. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. The desert seemed alive, watching. I spent a sleepless night, clutching my knife, heart pounding. At dawn, I packed what little I had and started walking toward the nearest road. Hours passed. The sun was merciless. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon an old, rusted pickup truck. abandoned and half buried in sand. Inside, I found a journal. It belonged to a man named Harold, a prospector who disappeared decades ago. His last entries spoke of strange figures, shadows moving just beyond sight, and a feeling of being hunted. He wrote of a desert wraith, a creature that claimed those foolish enough to wander too far. I read the final entry, penned in shaky handwriting. "The desert is alive, it takes. I fear it will take me next." I left the journal behind, took the road, and flagged down a passing car. I made it back to civilization, but the desert's grip never loosened. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear the dry wind whispering through the vents. I see footprints in the dust on my windowsill, large, uneven, and fading. The desert still watches, and it still waits. Story the end. The first time I saw the desert up close, it was just on a passing road trip with my family. But years later, when I got the job that brought me back to that vast, barren place, I realized how little I really understood about it, and how much it can hide beneath that endless sky. I was hired by a regional utility company doing maintenance on power lines that ran through parts of the Mojave Desert in Southern California. Nothing glamorous, just routine checks and repairs. I was part of a small crew, 4 of us, sent out to an isolated area where the lines crossed a stretch known locally as Devil's Flat. It was a hot July when we got dropped off at a tiny dirt lot where a narrow service road split off into the empty desert. The company truck was old but reliable, and our gear was packed tight. The first day was unremarkable. We went about inspecting poles and transformers, recording readings, and replacing parts that looked worn or damaged. The sun was brutal, the wind dry and hot, and there wasn't a hint of shade anywhere. I was used to tough conditions, but the desert had a way of getting into your bones. Even the crew, all veterans of field work, seemed subdued. The place carried a silence that felt thick, like it was swallowing all sound whole. We set up camp in the back of the truck around 6 p.m. when the heat finally started to ease. The desert night was cold and clear, the stars shining sharper than I'd ever seen. Out there, the Milky Way cut a bright swath across the sky like a glowing scar. I figured the silence was just part of the desert's character. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I tried to brush it off and went to sleep in the cab of the truck, but around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought I heard footsteps crunching on gravel outside. It was so faint, I almost convinced myself it was just the wind. But then came the sound of a low, guttural humming, not musical or melodic, but more like a growl, as if something was deep in pain or rage. I sat up and peered through the cracked window. The moon was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the rocks. At the edge of the light, I saw a figure standing still. It was tall, way taller than a man, but oddly slender. Its shape was humanoid, but the proportions were off. The arms hanging too low, the neck stretched in a strange way. The figure's face was turned away, so I couldn't make out any features. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was my imagination, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. When I woke the others, they were quiet but nodded, saying they'd felt it too. No one wanted to say it out loud, but something was off about Devil's Flat. The next day, we continued the inspection. I noticed the ground was littered with small animal bones, bleached white under the sun. The wind seemed to pick up a low moan that twisted like a living thing. My skin crawled as I checked the insulators on a pole, and when I glanced up, the figure was there again, standing in the distance. I called out, but no response. When I tried to approach, it disappeared like smoke. That night, the humming came back, louder this time. It wasn't just one sound, but layered, like multiple voices joining in some primal chant. We huddled in the truck, windows shut tight, but the sound pressed on the glass, rattling it softly. Rich, the oldest guy on our crew, swore it was the spirits of miners who had died nearby decades ago. A legend, sure, but his voice had a haunted edge that made me believe him. On the 3rd day, we found tracks around our camp. Human footprints, but the toes were too long and narrow, and the prints vanished abruptly near the rocks, as if whatever made them had leapt away. I followed them cautiously and found an old mine shaft entrance, almost swallowed by sand and brush. The wood framing was rotten and collapsing. Against my better judgment, I shined my flashlight inside. The air was thick and stale, and somewhere deep I heard that humming again, low and rhythmic. I took a few steps back before the flashlight flickered and died. When I got back to camp, Rich was gone. I called for him, checked around, but there was no sign. The others were nowhere to be found either. Panic set in, but then the humming shifted, closer, louder, all around us. My heart pounded as I jumped in the truck and tried the ignition. Nothing. The desert swallowed the sound of my desperate calls. Then the headlights caught the figure again. It stood near the mine entrance, slowly moving toward me. I screamed and slammed my door shut. The humming turned into a deafening roar in my ears. I covered my face and prayed it was a nightmare. When I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. The others reappeared, shaken but unharmed. They said they'd been walking in circles, unable to find their way back. None of us could explain what had happened or where Rich went. That was the last day we worked Devil's Flat. We reported the strange events, but the company dismissed it as heat exhaustion and hallucinations. They replaced the crew the next week and closed off the area. I haven't returned since, but sometimes when the night is still and the desert wind whistles past, I swear I hear that low humming, calling from the shadows of Devil's Flat. Story, the end. The sun was just beginning its slow crawl toward the horizon when I rolled off the main highway and onto the dirt road that led to the abandoned mining town of Rhyolite, Nevada. I had always been fascinated by ghost towns, but this was different. A solo weekend trip meant to escape the noise of Las Vegas and recharge with the solitude of the desert. I told myself I was prepared for the isolation, the heat, and the silence, but no amount of preparation could have braced me for what awaited me in the vast emptiness. Rhyolite sits nestled against the edge of the Bullfrog Hills, where the remains of old buildings, rusted machinery, and broken glass shimmer in the fading daylight. I arrived just before sunset, the last rays casting long shadows across cracked wood and crumbling stone. The place felt like a snapshot frozen in time, with stories etched into every weather-beaten surface. I pulled my Jeep into a flat clearing near what was once the town's general store and set up my small campsite. By nightfall, the temperature plummeted as desert nights tend to do. The stars were impossibly bright in the clear sky, and for a moment I felt at peace. I built a small fire and settled in with a flask of water and some beef jerky. The silence was profound, but it was the kind of silence that felt alive, like the desert itself was breathing, watching. Around midnight, when I was just about to crawl into my sleeping bag, I heard it. A faint shuffling sound coming from the edge of the ruins, near the collapsed foundation of what must have been someone's home. At first, I thought it was a coyote or some other desert animal, but the noise was too deliberate, too close. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of my tent, scanning the shadows. Nothing, just the skeletal frames of broken buildings and the wind whispering through dry brush. I shook my head and went back inside, but the feeling lingered, like I wasn't alone. The next morning, I explored the town in the harsh light of day. The buildings were in various states of decay, some mere piles of rubble, others still standing like ghostly sentinels. I took photos and made notes, imagining the lives of the people who once called this place home. It was easy to picture miners and their families eking out a living, the promise of gold shimmering just beneath the surface. Later, as I wandered toward the old bank building, I noticed something strange. Footprints, fresh footprints, leading into the ruins. They were bare footprints, pressed into the dusty earth. I looked around, but saw no sign of anyone. Unease crept in. I followed the prints carefully, my flashlight off for now, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever had been there. The prints led toward the old hospital building, an empty shell with shattered windows and doors hanging on broken hinges. Inside, the air was stale and cold despite the desert heat outside. I stepped cautiously, the floorboards creaking underfoot. Suddenly, I caught sight of a figure out of the corner of my eye, a silhouette standing motionless near what used to be the nurse's station. I spun around, flashlight raised, but no one was there. My heart pounded. I told myself it was a trick of the light or exhaustion, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, as I lay in my tent, the wind picked up and the temperature dropped sharply. The silence was broken by the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of brush, but one sound stood out, a faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the tapping continued, steady and deliberate, out like someone knocking on the side of my tent. I froze, staring into the darkness. The sound stopped, then started again, this time from a different direction. My mind raced. Was it an animal? A person? I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the desert. Nothing. Just the empty night and the faint glow of distant stars. The next morning, I packed up quickly, eager to leave. On the way back to the Jeep, I spotted something partially buried in the sand near the edge of the ruins, a tarnished silver locket. I picked it up, wiped away the dirt, and opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of a woman and a child, faces worn with time but unmistakably real. A shiver ran down my spine. I slipped the locket into my pocket, not knowing why, but feeling an inexplicable connection to the lost souls of the town. As I drove away from Rhyolite, the desert seemed to close in behind me, swallowing the ghost town whole, but I knew that some part of it would never let me go. Weeks later, back home in Los Angeles, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I researched the history of Rhyolite and found accounts of strange disappearances, unexplained noises, and sightings of figures in the ruins. Locals spoke of a watcher, a presence that lingered, bound to the land and its tragic past. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I hear the tapping again. Not outside my tent, but in my mind. A reminder that some places are never truly abandoned, and that the desert keeps its secrets close, waiting for those who dare to listen. Story the end. The dry wind was already picking up as I pulled off the highway onto the dirt track leading to the abandoned mining camp. I'd been hired by a small historical preservation group to document the ruins, and it was supposed to be a straightforward assignment. 3 days in the desert, photographing and cataloging the remains of a 19th century gold mine. Nothing special, just some dusty old wood and rusted equipment. I'd done similar work before and was used to being alone in remote places. But the desert, well, the desert has a way of turning even the most mundane tasks into something else entirely. The camp was about 45 miles outside of Tucson, Arizona, deep in the Sonoran Desert. The sun was sinking low when I arrived, casting the jagged hills in long shadows. The camp consisted of a handful of decaying wooden buildings arranged loosely around a dry wash. The main structure, the old assay office, still stood mostly intact, but everything else looked like it might collapse at a touch. I set up my gear quickly, unpacked my camera, and took some shots of the fading sunlight on the weathered timbers. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag under the thin canvas of my tent, the wind began to howl. It rattled the poles and sent dust swirling in eerie patterns across the landscape. I've always found desert nights beautiful in a harsh way, but this was different. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. I was woken around 2 a.m. by a faint noise. It was a soft scraping sound like nails dragging slowly across stone. I sat up, heart thumping, and listened. The sound stopped. I convinced myself it was the wind playing tricks. The second night was worse. About midnight, I heard footsteps crunching just outside my tent. Slow, deliberate. Not like an animal, no paws or claws, but human. Someone or something was walking slowly around my camp, circling it in the dark. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, but there was nothing there. No footprints in the sand. No other signs of life. The desert was empty and silent again. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I found strange marks around my campsite, scratches in the dirt that looked like claws but too big for any local wildlife, and piles of small stones arranged in circles. Some had bits of animal bones placed on top, bleached white in the harsh sun. That afternoon, I took my truck and drove a few miles down the road, hoping to get a better signal and call my supervisor. The reception was spotty, but I managed a quick check-in. I mentioned the noises, the stones, the footprints. "Must be local kids messing around," she said with a laugh. "You're alone out there, right? Stay safe." I laughed, but the unease didn't leave me. That night, the scraping returned, louder this time. I swore I heard whispers carried on the wind, voices faint but urgent, in a language I didn't understand. The temperature dropped suddenly, even though the desert rarely cools off this much after dark. I tried to keep calm and went outside to check, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rocky outcrops and dry shrubs. Then I saw it, a figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the edge of the camp. It didn't move. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal either. Its limbs were too long, and its skin seemed to shimmer with the desert heat. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. On the third day, I packed up as fast as I could. As I loaded the last of my gear into the truck, I saw that more stone circles had appeared overnight. Dozens of them, surrounding the camp like a ring of silent watchers. I didn't look back as I drove away. The sun was already setting, and the desert seemed darker, more alive than when I arrived. Back in town, I tried to tell people what happened. They smiled politely and nodded, calling it heat exhaustion or hallucinations. Maybe they were right, but sometimes when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear those whispers, carried on the desert air, waiting for the next visitor to listen. Story the end. The sun had been relentless all day, beating down on the cracked earth of the Nevada desert like a hammer. Dust swirled in lazy eddies across the empty highway as I drove deeper into the wilderness, chasing an old lead on a story. My name is Mark, a journalist who had been assigned to cover the story of a series of disappearances around a small town called Pahrump. The locals were tight-lipped, but the pattern was clear. People going missing without a trace, and no official explanation. I was skeptical at first. Desert towns always had legends, stories of strange things lurking in the shadows, but real danger, that was rare. Still, the more I dug, the more uneasy I became. The desert wasn't just empty land. It held secrets, and I wanted to find out what. I arrived in Pahrump late in the afternoon. The town was small, dusty, and had that worn-out feeling that many desert towns had. A handful of shops, a rundown gas station, and a diner where locals gathered like they were trying to preserve some last piece of normalcy. I stopped at the diner first, hoping to get a feel for the place. The waitress, an older woman named Karen, gave me a guarded look when I asked about the disappearances. "Ain't nothing to talk about," she said firmly, pouring coffee without looking up. But I caught the hesitation in her voice. After a moment, she leaned in and whispered, "You don't want to go out there alone, not after dark." I thanked her and finished my coffee quickly, eager to see the desert for myself. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. I had brought a tent and supplies, planning to camp near the edge of the desert to get a first-hand sense of the area. As I drove out of town, the road narrowed, twisting between rocky outcrops and scrub brush. The air grew dry and heavy, and the silence was thick. No birds, no animals, nothing but the hum of my truck's engine. I pulled off near a small wash, setting up my camp under a towering Joshua tree. The desert sky was breathtaking, filled with stars that seemed impossibly close, but the beauty was deceptive. Something about the stillness felt wrong. I tried to shake the feeling and sat down to write in my journal. Then a flicker of movement caught my eye at the edge of the wash. A shadow, just for a second, barely visible in the fading light. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area. Nothing. I told myself it was a trick of the light or an animal, but the pit in my stomach deepened. That night, I barely slept. Strange noises echoed around the camp, distant footsteps crunching on gravel, low murmurs that seemed too faint to be real. When I shone my flashlight beyond the tree line, I thought I saw glowing eyes watching me. The next day, I decided to explore the nearby hills. The terrain was rugged, but I was determined. As I climbed higher, the temperature soared. Sweat stung my eyes and my throat felt like sandpaper. I drank water slowly, careful not to dehydrate. Near the summit, I stumbled upon an old, rusted shack, half buried by sand and surrounded by skeletal remains of small animals. The door creaked open with a touch. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and something else, a faint metallic smell. I found scraps of old newspapers and personal belongings scattered on the floor. It looked like someone had lived here long ago and then vanished. Suddenly, I heard a soft voice behind me. "Why are you here?" I spun around. There was no one. My heart pounded. I told myself I was imagining things, but the voice had sounded so real. I decided it was time to head back. As I descended, shadows lengthened and twisted into strange shapes. I kept my flashlight on, but the beam seemed to struggle against the darkness. Back at camp, I found my supplies had been disturbed. My water bottle was tipped over, and the zipper on my tent was slightly undone. I had locked everything tightly before I left. The unease grew into fear. That night, the noises returned, louder and closer. Footsteps circled my tent, stopping suddenly. I held my breath, flashlight trembling in my hand. Then a whisper. barely audible. Leave. I wanted to believe it was wind or some desert animal, but the tone was unmistakable, a warning. I packed up in the dark, heart racing, and drove back to Pahrump. The next morning, I went to the sheriff's office, hoping for answers. Sheriff Daniels was a gruff man with tired eyes. He listened quietly as I told him about the noises and the disturbed campsite. He sighed. "You're lucky to be alive." "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, voice low. "There's something out there, not human. People disappear all the time and we can't explain it." I pressed him for details, but he shook his head. "It's better you don't know." That night, back in town, I stayed at a motel. The room was cheap and smelled like mildew. I lay awake, every creak and groan of the building amplified in the silence. At around midnight, I heard scratching at the window. I looked outside, nothing but darkness. Then a face appeared, pale, gaunt, with eyes too large and black to be human. It vanished as quickly as it came. I didn't sleep after that. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. But as I packed, I found a note slipped under the door. It was scrawled in shaky handwriting, "Get out before they come." I drove away fast, not stopping until the town was a distant speck in the rearview mirror. Weeks later, I tried to piece it all together. The desert held more than just heat and sand. It was home to something old, something that didn't want visitors. I never wrote the story. Some things are better left buried beneath the endless dunes. Story the end. The sun was setting low on the horizon as I pulled my aging pickup off the 2-lane highway and onto the rough dirt road leading into the desolate stretch of the Mojave Desert. I'd been driving for hours, leaving behind the neon haze of Las Vegas, chasing a tip from an old friend about a place called Bone Spring, a forgotten watering hole in the desert that had somehow slipped off the map. For years, it was said to be a resting spot for travelers and miners. But after a series of strange disappearances, the area gained a bad reputation, becoming a ghost story whispered among desert folk. I wasn't much for ghost stories. I'm a skeptic by nature. But there was something about this place that drew me. Maybe it was the mystery, or maybe I just needed a break from the noise of the city. Whatever it was, I decided to take a solo trip, pack light, and see if I could find anything worth writing about. The road narrowed and deteriorated the deeper I drove in, a few signs warning about flash floods and unstable ground, but no other traffic for miles. I rolled down the window to catch the dry, warm air, sun-baked and still. The wind was eerily silent, not even the usual buzz of cicadas or the distant howl of coyotes. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I reached a clearing where a rusted-out windmill creaked in the weak breeze. This had to be Bone Spring. The watering hole was dry now, just cracked earth and brittle weeds. The place had an unsettling stillness to it, like time had stopped years ago. I set up my camp a little way off, near some rocks that could shield me from the wind if it picked up. As night fell, the sky exploded with stars, clearer and brighter than I'd ever seen. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light. I took a few pictures, fascinated by the beauty and the quiet. Then I sat by the fire I'd built, letting the crackling flames fill the silence. I tried to shake the feeling that something was watching me. About midnight, I heard a faint sound, soft footsteps crunching on dry brush. I swung my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. The footsteps came again, closer this time, but there was no figure, no animal, just footsteps fading into silence. I told myself it was my imagination. Still, I couldn't sleep. I kept my rifle within reach, eyes darting to every shadow. Around 2 a.m., a chill wind blew through camp, strange for the desert at this time of year. The flames of my fire flickered wildly and then dimmed. The shadows around me deepened, and the silence returned, but heavier this time, oppressive. Then came a low, guttural whisper. I couldn't make out words, but it sounded like someone or something was speaking in a language long forgotten, right outside my tent. Heart hammering, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the darkness. Nothing. I unzipped the tent cautiously and stepped out. The desert stretched out, empty and still, the stars above indifferent to my fear. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded small and fragile. No answer. I returned inside, locking the tent zipper tight. The whispering continued sporadically until dawn, never loud, never close enough to locate. When morning finally came, I packed quickly, eager to leave. But as I walked to my truck, I saw something etched in the dirt near the fire pit, a symbol, unfamiliar and jagged, drawn with sticks or claws. I took a photo, but a cold dread settled in my chest. Back on the highway, I stopped at a small diner to grab breakfast and internet access. I searched for any information on the symbol, but found nothing. The locals in the diner were polite, but wary when I asked about Bone Spring or any strange happenings in the desert. An old man named Charlie sitting nearby finally spoke up. "You best be careful out there," he said. "Some places in the desert, they don't like visitors." I pressed him, asking about the disappearances. "People vanish all the time," he said, eyes distant. "Swallowed by the desert or worse." He didn't say more. I decided to head back, but curiosity gnawed at me. That night at the motel, my dreams were haunted by flickering shadows and those whispers again. I woke up soaked in sweat, heart pounding. The next day, I returned to the desert, this time with more gear, a camera, extra, water, and a GPS. I wanted to find that symbol's meaning. As I walked near Bone Spring again, the air seemed to thicken, like walking through invisible fog. My radio crackled with static. The temperature dropped suddenly. Then I saw them, figures at the edge of my vision, pale and thin, disappearing when I looked directly. I tried to capture them on camera, but the images came out blank, just static. A voice echoed in the wind, clearer this time. "Go back." I ignored it, moving toward a cave hidden in the nearby rocks. Inside, the walls were covered in more symbols, drawn in what looked like dried blood. A sudden noise behind me made me whirl around. A figure stood there, half shrouded in shadow, with sunken eyes and a mouth twisted in a silent scream. I stumbled back, tripping over rocks, and ran out of the cave, gasping. Back at camp, the whispering was louder, and my tent zipper was undone. I grabbed my things and fled, driving through the night with the feeling that unseen eyes followed me. I never went back. The desert hides its secrets well, and some stories are better left buried beneath the endless dunes. Story the end. The morning started just like any other for Jason. He had been a truck driver for over a decade, and the desert runs were some of his favorites. Not because they were easy, but because there was something about the vast openness, the brutal sun, and the endless horizon that felt almost meditative. He was a man of routine, disciplined and cautious, but the desert always had a way of reminding him how small and fragile humans really were. This particular trip was supposed to be straightforward. A load from Phoenix, Arizona to a small mining town in southern Nevada, a little detour through the desert, and then back to his home in Las Vegas. He was carrying mining equipment, heavy, bulky gear that took up the entire trailer. The company had warned him that cell service would be spotty, but Jason didn't think much of it. He'd driven these roads before. The weather forecast was clear and dry. He left Phoenix early, the sky already bright and the sun climbing fast. The highway was mostly empty, save for a few other truckers and a handful of RVs heading out for the weekend. He liked the silence on these roads, just the hum of the engine, the wind, and the occasional buzz of cicadas. The landscape on either side was the classic Mojave Desert, scrubby bushes, cracked earth, and towering saguaro cacti standing like ancient sentinels. About 2 hours in, Jason pulled over at a rest stop just off the highway near a tiny town called Beatty. He grabbed a soda and some jerky, stretched his legs, and checked his load. Everything was secure. The desert sun was already merciless, beating down on everything in sight. He looked at the horizon, flat and shimmering with heat, and felt the familiar itch of isolation that only the desert could provide. Back on the road, he noticed the GPS was glitching, flickering between no signal and weak bars. That was unusual, but not alarming. Soon, the highway curved off toward a smaller, less maintained road leading closer to the mining site. This was where the cell signal vanished completely. Jason drove slower now, paying more attention to the road. It was narrow and gravelly, with tire tracks suggesting recent use but not heavy traffic. The landscape grew more rugged, with jagged rock formations rising like broken teeth. He spotted vultures circling overhead and thought about the stories he'd heard about the desert's dangers. Still, he told himself that as long as he stayed on the path, he'd be fine. An hour later, the truck's engine sputtered, then died. Jason tried to restart it, but nothing. He cursed under his breath. He had fuel, but the engine just wouldn't turn over. The heat pressed in around him. His phone was dead for signal and battery. The truck's radio crackled with static, but no other voices. He was alone. Jason grabbed his water bottle and some tools, deciding to inspect the engine. The heat was unbearable, the sun beating down, making the metal trailer almost too hot to touch. He popped the hood and started working, sweat streaming down his face. As he worked, he heard something faint, a low hum, almost like distant singing carried on the wind. He stopped, listening carefully, but it faded. Probably just the desert breeze playing tricks. He shook his head and focused back on the truck. Minutes passed. The humming returned, this time louder, like a chorus of voices whispering in a language he didn't recognize. Unease settled in his stomach. He stood up and scanned the horizon, but saw nothing. Only the endless desert and the shimmering heat. Frustrated, he decided to check the water tank. He opened the cap and took a sip. The water tasted off, metallic, almost bitter. He frowned, then decided to keep it aside for now. His mind started playing tricks, conjuring desert mirages and hallucinations from dehydration. He found a shaded spot under a large boulder to rest and think. As he sat, the humming returned, but this time it wasn't far away. It was right next to him. Jason whipped his head around, searching for the source. The shadows under the boulder shifted. He caught a glimpse of movement, a figure standing just beyond the edge of his vision. The figure was tall and gaunt, dressed in old mining clothes that looked decades out of date. Its face was pale, and its eyes seemed hollow, dark pits reflecting nothing. Jason blinked, and the figure was gone. He told himself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and heat stroke. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Panicked, Jason stood and scanned the desert around him. He tried calling for help on the radio again. Static answered. Determined, he decided to walk back toward the highway. Maybe someone could give him a ride or at least call for assistance. He grabbed his water and some snacks and started moving. The desert stretched endlessly. The sun was setting now, turning the sky a deep orange, shadows growing long and cold. The temperature dropped quickly, leaving an eerie chill in the air. As he walked, the humming followed him, sometimes faint, sometimes loud enough to make his skin crawl. The voices whispered unintelligible words, but one phrase stood out. Go back. Jason quickened his pace, heart pounding. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but the desert was shifting. Rocks that hadn't been there moments before blocked his path. The wind kicked up suddenly, swirling dust and debris. In the distance, he saw a small shack, weathered and abandoned. Desperation pushed him forward. Maybe someone lived there. Maybe they could help. He approached cautiously. The door creaked open on its own as he reached for the handle. Inside, the shack was empty, except for a dusty table and an old lantern. On the table lay a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. Jason picked it up and began reading. The journal belonged to a miner named Samuel, who had disappeared in the desert decades ago. The entries grew more frantic as he read, talk of strange shadows stalking him, voices in the wind, and warnings about the watchers who guarded the desert's secrets. One entry chilled Jason to his core. Samuel wrote that if you followed the desert too far, if you trespassed on sacred ground, the watchers would trap you, turning you into one of them, lost souls condemned to wander the sands forever. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind Jason. The shack plunged into darkness. His flashlight flickered on, and the air grew cold. The humming was all around him, louder, closer. Jason spun around and saw the same gaunt figure from earlier, along with others, shadows with hollow eyes emerging from the walls and floor. They whispered his name, beckoning him to join them. Fear overwhelmed him. He ran for the door, banging and pulling at the handle until it finally gave way. He burst out into the desert night. The stars overhead were cold and distant. The humming faded, replaced by the sound of his own frantic breathing and footsteps crunching on the gravel. He ran until he collapsed, exhausted, near a cluster of rocks. As dawn approached, the desert was silent again. A passing ranger found Jason hours later, dehydrated and delirious, but alive. He had no memory of how far he'd wandered or what exactly happened. Back at the repair shop, they found the truck had suffered a sudden electrical failure. No signs of tampering or damage. Jason's story about the watchers and the voices was met with skepticism, but the pale, haunted look in his eyes told a different story. He never returned to the desert after that trip, but he still hears the humming sometimes, just on the edge of hearing, like a warning not to go back. The desert keeps its secrets, and some are better left undiscovered. Story the end. The desert was never supposed to be a place where I'd face anything more than harsh sun and the occasional rattlesnake. Growing up in Phoenix, I'd always thought of the desert as a wild, open space. Empty, but never truly empty. The stories people whispered about things lurking in the sands always sounded like campfire exaggerations. But that changed the summer I turned 27. I was working as a field technician for a utility company, mostly handling electrical maintenance on remote power lines that crossed stretches of the Sonoran Desert. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid decent, and it gave me a reason to be outdoors, away from the buzz of the city. The desert had a raw beauty, but also a silence that pressed on you, thick and suffocating. One afternoon around early July, I got dispatched with a small crew to check out a transmission tower roughly 40 miles east of Phoenix, near an area called the Tonto Basin. The report was a possible malfunction, flickering power, and a faint burning smell picked up by nearby hikers. We loaded up the company truck with tools and gear and headed out. The ride was long, dust trails behind us, the sun roasting the landscape. By the time we reached the service road that led to the tower, the sky was a sharp, blinding blue, with heat waves rising from the cracked earth. We parked near the base of the tower and unloaded the equipment. My boss, Jim, told me to take the lead and do a line inspection while he and the others handled the tower itself. The job was routine. Check the insulators, test the wiring, note any corrosion or damage. I had done this dozens of times. The desert can be unforgiving to metal. I walked carefully across the rocky ground toward the power lines stretching into the distance. The isolation was immediate. No birds, no wind. Even the usual insects were absent. The silence felt unnatural. As I approached the first pylon, I noticed something odd on the ground. Footprints. Not human ones, but large, deep impressions, spaced unevenly, as if something heavy had walked there, dragging its feet. I paused and scanned the surrounding brush, expecting maybe a wild animal had left them. But the prints were too large, too defined, like claws or talons. I snapped a photo with my phone. A sudden chill went down my spine, even though the sun was beating down mercilessly. I called Jim on the radio to tell him about the footprints. He laughed and told me I was imagining things. The desert plays tricks on you, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I continued along the power line, noting every detail, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement at the edges of my vision, shadows slipping behind rocks or between cacti. But when I turned, nothing was there. By late afternoon, I reached the last tower on the line. As I climbed up to inspect the insulators, I felt a sudden sharp pain in my ankle. I looked down and saw a scorpion, its tail arched, ready to strike. I froze, then slapped it away, lucky it didn't sting me. Shaking off the incident, I finished the inspection quickly and radioed Jim to say I was done. The sun was dropping low, the desert turning to orange and purple hues. On my way back, I took a shortcut through a narrow canyon between two rocky outcrops. It was cooler here, shadows lengthening, but the air felt thick and still. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the canyon, half hidden in shadow. At first, I thought it was a hiker or someone else in the desert, but as I squinted, I realized the figure was unnaturally tall, at least 7 feet, and oddly thin. Its limbs were elongated, and it moved in a jerky, unnatural way. The skin looked pale, almost translucent, with dark patches. I blinked and looked again. The figure vanished. My heart pounded. I called out, "Hello? Are you okay?" No response. I hurried back to the truck, every step echoing unnervingly against the rock walls. When I reached the truck, Jim was waiting, looking concerned. "Dude, you look like you saw a ghost," he said. I told him what I'd seen. He gave me a skeptical look, but didn't press. That night, back at the motel in Payson, I tried to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I dreamed of the desert, of that tall, pale figure watching me from the shadows, eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. The next morning, I returned to Phoenix, but the experience stayed with me. A few weeks later, I heard about a search party near Tonto Basin. A local hiker had gone missing. The description of his clothes matched the figure I saw, but the search found no trace. I never went back to that part of the desert. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear something scratching at my window. something tall and thin waiting just outside the edge of the light. The desert doesn't forget. Story, the end. The sun was setting behind the horizon, casting long, twisted shadows across the endless expanse of the Nevada desert. It was early September, and the heat of the day was beginning to fade into the chill that only desert nights could bring. I had been driving all day, navigating back roads and highways, intent on reaching a remote archaeological site near the border of Nevada and California. The job was simple enough: assist a team of researchers in documenting some newly discovered petroglyphs that had caught the interest of a few universities. I wasn't an archaeologist, just a field assistant, a gig I picked up because it paid better than waiting tables. My name's Jake, by the way. I'm 28 and grew up in Las Vegas, so the desert isn't unfamiliar to me. Still, that night was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I arrived at the site around 6 p.m., just as the last light of day was bleeding away. The other team members, 3 grad students and the lead researcher, Dr. Adams, were already setting up camp near an old, abandoned mining shack that looked like it belonged to a different century. The shack sat isolated in a small valley, its weathered wood bleached gray and cracking under years of sun and wind. We pitched tents, unloaded gear, and ate some cold sandwiches. The desert was peaceful, eerily so, but I noticed a few things right away that unsettled me. The silence was almost unnatural. No coyotes, no insects buzzing. The wind had dropped to a dead calm, and despite the fading light, I felt like something was watching us. Dr. Adams dismissed my concerns. She was a sharp woman, always buried in her books, and she told me it was normal for the desert to get quiet before nightfall. I wanted to believe her. That first night was uneventful, aside from the strange quiet. I lay in my tent, trying to sleep, but the darkness felt suffocating. I kept hearing distant noises, soft thuds, or something scraping across the dirt. But every time I shone my flashlight out the tent flap, there was nothing. The next morning, we all set out early to examine the petroglyphs carved into a nearby rock face. They were ancient symbols, spirals, zigzags, figures that looked almost human. Dr. Adams was thrilled. She said the markings could rewrite parts of Native American history. Around midday, the air was already blistering hot, and I was getting tired of the sun's relentless glare. I took a break and wandered off a bit on my own to get water from a small creek marked on the map. As I stepped off the path, something caught my eye. Footprints. They weren't human, at least not exactly. The prints were elongated, with sharp, claw-like impressions at the front. They disappeared into the brush. I called out to the others, but got no response. I felt a shiver creep down my spine, though the heat was stifling. I brushed it off as my imagination and headed back. By nightfall, things started to go wrong. As we gathered around the campfire, the flames flickering, I saw shadows moving just beyond the light's reach. Every time I looked, they vanished. The others were chatting, seemingly unaware. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate tapping on the roof of the shack. The rest of the group fell silent too, staring upward. The tapping stopped. A tense pause followed. I told Dr. Adams to check it out, but she hesitated. "We should stay inside," she said quietly. We all went into the shack. The air inside was stale and cold despite the desert heat. I lit a lantern and scanned the ceiling. Nothing. Just then, a low growl came from outside, distant but unmistakable. The hair on my arms stood up. For the rest of the night, we heard footsteps circling the camp, scratching sounds against wood, soft snarls. The wind began to pick up, carrying an odd scent, sulfur and something metallic. Around 3 a.m., the power bank we used to recharge our equipment died inexplicably, even though it was fully charged. My phone's battery dropped to 0 despite minimal use. Then came the sound that made me freeze, a deep, guttural breathing right outside the door. No one dared move. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded and the night returned to stillness. The next morning, 2 of the grad students were missing. We searched everywhere. The brush, the rocky hills, but no sign of them. Their tents were undisturbed, their belongings untouched. Dr. Adams was pale but insisted we keep working. She said maybe they wandered off, disoriented. I wasn't convinced. I wanted to leave, but I was outnumbered. That afternoon, as we photographed the petroglyphs, I felt eyes on me again. I turned and caught a glimpse of something slinking between the rocks. Tall, thin, with glowing amber eyes. It disappeared before I could get a better look. That night was worse. The remaining team members barricaded themselves inside the shack. The scratching returned, louder this time, pounding on the walls. I saw marks where the creature had tried to claw its way in. We stayed awake, taking turns keeping watch. By dawn, we were exhausted, scared out of our minds. I was ready to leave. The last night I spent there, I couldn't sleep. I sat outside the shack, staring at the empty desert. Suddenly, the ground nearby shifted. I looked down and saw those clawed footprints again, fresh, heading toward me. I scrambled back inside just as something slammed against the door. I never saw the thing, but the force was enough to crack the wood. At first light, we packed up and fled. Back in town, we reported the disappearances, but authorities found no evidence of what happened. I still get nightmares about those glowing eyes and the creature that haunted that desert valley. The desert isn't just empty sand and rocks. Sometimes it watches. Sometimes it hunts. Story the end. The first time I drove into the desert alone, I thought it was going to be an adventure. I was a young man, freshly graduated with a degree in anthropology, eager to prove myself. The job was simple: catalog some petroglyphs and ruins on a patch of BLM land in southern Arizona. The area wasn't popular or touristy, more like forgotten. The kind of place you could vanish and no one would come looking. I told my parents I'd be fine. It was only a week, just me and my gear camping out under the stars. They worried, naturally. Desert heat can kill, they said. But I figured I knew what I was doing. The first few days were peaceful, even beautiful in a harsh way. The sun beat down, turning the scrub brush into brittle shadows. Nights were cold, sharp under a crystal sky. I found some petroglyphs carved into sandstone cliffs, ancient hands and spirals, animals, strange humanoid figures. I took pictures, wrote notes, and tried to piece together what the symbols meant. On the third day, I discovered something else. Near an arroyo, I found a circle of stones arranged like a crude fire pit. It was old but not ancient, maybe a few decades at most. Around it were scattered bones, not just animal bones, but human ones too. Small fragments, broken teeth, finger bones. That night, as I sat by my own campfire, the wind whispered. I swear the breeze wasn't just moving sand. It carried voices. Quiet at first, almost melodic, like a chant in a language I didn't know. I strained to listen, but the words slipped away like smoke. I told myself it was the wind playing tricks on me. The desert has a way of messing with your mind. On the fourth day, while exploring a nearby canyon, I stumbled on an abandoned shack. It was made of plywood and corrugated metal, rusted and sun-bleached. Inside, there was a faded journal. The pages were brittle and yellowed, but the handwriting was neat. The journal belonged to a man named Earl, who claimed he was a prospector in the 1960s. He wrote about finding veins of gold, but more chilling were his later entries. Earl spoke of hearing voices at night, of shadows moving just beyond his firelight. He wrote about the whisperers, entities he believed lived beneath the desert, watching from the rocks, hungry for the living. I laughed nervously, packed the journal in my bag, and left the shack. That night the whispers returned, louder and more urgent. I dreamt of falling into a pit of darkness, of clawing at dry earth and feeling cold hands grip my ankles. The next morning I woke to find my camp ransacked. My supplies were strewn about, water bottles emptied, food scattered. I hadn't heard a thing. My journal was missing. Panic set in. I packed up and decided to leave. On the trail back, I saw them. Figures. At first, they were shadows cast by the morning sun, tall, thin shapes among the rocks. But as I blinked, they moved, not like animals, but fluid, unnatural. I ran. My feet kicked up dust as I sprinted toward my truck. The desert seemed endless, the heat suffocating. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I dared a glance and saw no one, just the heat haze and silence. When I reached the truck, the keys weren't in the ignition. I fumbled in my pockets. They were gone. The whispering voices surrounded me, growing louder. I grabbed a rock and prepared to defend myself. Then the sun dropped behind a ridge, plunging the desert into twilight. The figures emerged fully, elongated limbs, eyes that gleamed like coals, mouths stretching in silent screams. I ran again, stumbling into the darkness, the sand cold beneath my hands. I don't remember how long I ran. Days? Hours? When I finally collapsed near a highway, a passing motorist called for help. I was found wandering, dehydrated, and delirious. The authorities searched the area, but no shack, no petroglyphs, no circle of stones or bones, only endless, empty desert. My journal never turned up. I never returned. Sometimes at night, I still hear the whispering, and I know the desert is watching, waiting. Story the end. The first thing I need to say is that this is the story I've never wanted to tell. Not because I'm ashamed, but because I don't know how anyone would believe it. I don't blame anyone who thinks it's a fabrication, a hallucination, or a nightmare I made up. But this happened to me, right there in the desert outside Joshua Tree, California. It was the summer of 2014, and I was 28 years old. I grew up in a small town in Arizona, so the desert wasn't unfamiliar, but Joshua Tree was different, more remote, more rugged, and for me, a place to escape from the noise of life. I had recently left a job in Phoenix and wanted some time alone to clear my head. That's why I packed my truck with camping gear and supplies, planning a solo trip deep into the backcountry. My plan was simple: hike during the day, camp at night, and spend a week disconnected from everything. No phone, no internet, no distractions, just me, my backpack, and the vast desert. On the first day, I made good progress. The sun was hot but manageable with early starts and long breaks. I followed a rough trail that wound through rocky canyons and sparse scrubland. By evening, I found a flat spot near some large boulders to set up camp. I pitched my tent and settled in, cooking a small meal over a portable stove. The desert was quiet except for the occasional wind that stirred the dry brush. I remember feeling a deep sense of calm as I watched the stars emerge. I drifted off around 10 p.m. I woke suddenly at around 1:30 a.m. to a strange sound, something scraping against the side of my tent. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It wasn't sand or branches. It sounded like nails or claws dragging slowly. My heart raced. I held my breath and waited, but after a minute, the sound stopped. I told myself it was probably a desert fox or some other animal. But sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I noticed something odd. The ground around my tent had shallow impressions, like small footprints, but they weren't from any animal I recognized. They were roughly human-shaped, but too small and unevenly spaced. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe some prank by other campers, but no one was supposed to be out here. Over the next 2 days, I stuck to my route, but the unease grew. I felt eyes on me constantly, even when I was alone on the trail. On the third night, I camped near an old mining ruin, a crumbling wooden shack and rusted machinery scattered among rocks. That night, the temperature dropped quickly. I stayed in my tent, trying to ignore the wind that had picked up. But then, I heard footsteps again. This time, they circled my tent multiple times, slow and methodical. I unzipped a small flap and shone my flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. The steps stopped abruptly, as if whoever was out there vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed up quickly and continued. But as I crossed a dry wash, I noticed fresh tire tracks leading deeper into the canyon. They were recent, too deep and wide for a dirt bike, probably an ATV or truck. I had not seen any other vehicles on the map or in person. The tracks headed toward a narrow ravine that wasn't marked on any map I had. Curiosity gnawed at me, but I ignored it and moved on. That evening, I camped at a small plateau overlooking a vast valley. The sunset was breathtaking, but I could feel the desert closing in. I lit a fire and tried to eat, but my stomach was tight with anxiety. Around 11 p.m., I heard voices, low murmurs coming from the direction of the ravine. I couldn't make out words, just fragmented syllables like chanting or a conversation half hidden in the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of my tent. There was nothing but shadows and silence. I convinced myself it was my mind playing tricks. After all, isolation messes with you. I tried to sleep again, but I kept waking up to strange noises, scraping, whispering, footsteps. I started to question my senses. The next morning, I found something that broke my skepticism. Near my campsite, partially buried in the sand, was a weathered, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed and fragile. I opened it carefully. Inside were entries dated back over 50 years. The handwriting was hurried and uneven. The author was a man named Carl Benson, a prospector who had been exploring the area in the 1960s. His entries spoke of a presence in the canyon, something watching him, following him, sometimes appearing in the distance. He described strange symbols carved into rocks and a voice that whispered to him at night. The last entry was scrawled in panic. "They come at night. They don't want me to leave. If anyone finds this, stay away from the canyon. Chills ran down my spine. I knew then that I had stumbled into something I shouldn't. I debated leaving immediately, but the sun was high, and I wanted to finish my planned route. That afternoon, as I approached the ravine mentioned in the journal, I felt the air shift, the wind stopped, the temperature dropped. I saw the symbols, strange, jagged markings carved into stones, arranged in a circle. The ground inside the circle was bare and oddly dark. Suddenly, a sharp pain stabbed my leg. I looked down, a thorny plant, but it wasn't native to the area. I tried to pull it free, but the pain intensified. I fell back, my vision blurring. When I came to, it was night. I was lying outside the circle. The campfire was dead. I scrambled to my feet, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I heard movement, soft footsteps approaching. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area. There, at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. Tall, shadowy, features indistinct, but the eyes glowed faintly. I screamed and ran without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached my truck at the trailhead 3 hours later. I left the desert that night. I've never gone back. Some nights, when the wind's just right, I hear whispers, the same murmurs from the canyon. I don't know what I encountered out there, but whatever it was, it's still there. And it's waiting. Story the end. The desert is a place that tests your limits, physically, mentally, and sometimes spiritually. I learned that the hard way one summer, years ago, when I went out with a small group of friends to hike a little-known section of the Sonoran Desert in Arizona. We'd all been looking for adventure, something off the beaten path to shake us out of our routines. None of us could have guessed that what awaited us would be something none of us would ever forget. I'm Jason, and this is my story. We planned the trip carefully, or so we thought. 4 of us, me, Sarah, Mike, and Emily. We were all in our mid-20s, college buddies who still loved the outdoors. The desert was unforgiving, but we had experience. We carried plenty of water, food, and equipment. Our target was a trail near a ghost town called Gila Bend, an abandoned mining settlement buried under decades of sun and sand. We drove out from Phoenix early in the morning, the heat rising quickly even as the sun was just climbing the horizon. The roads narrowed and wound through rocky hills, the landscape barren but strangely beautiful. We stopped at the last gas station for supplies, extra water, sunscreen, and a map that barely showed the trails we wanted to hike. The locals gave us the usual warnings: stay on the path, don't hike alone, and be careful after dark. But we laughed it off, eager to begin. Our first day was uneventful. The trail twisted through dry washes and over scrubby hills. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of our boots on gravel and the occasional call of a distant hawk. At night, we camped near the ruins of the old town, sitting around a small fire, telling stories and marveling at the stars. But on the second night, everything changed. It started subtly. Sarah was the first to notice it. A faint whispering carried on the wind. At first, it seemed like the rustling of leaves, but the more we listened, the clearer it became. The whispers were words, soft and urgent, spoken in a language none of us recognized. Maybe it's just the wind playing tricks, Mike said, but even his voice lacked conviction. We all felt uneasy, but tried to brush it off. Later, as we settled into our tents, the whispers grew louder. Outside, the desert air was still and heavy, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. I awoke to the sound of footsteps circling our camp. The crunching of gravel and dry brush made my heart race. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside, but the beam only caught darkness. Suddenly, a shape darted past, something small, quick, and shadowy. "Did you see that?" Emily whispered, eyes wide. "No," I said, trying to steady my breath. The rest of the night was a blur of restless sleep and uneasy dreams, visions of figures cloaked in dust, faces pale and sunken, watching us from the darkness. The next morning, the desert seemed to breathe a little easier. We packed up, eager to leave, but as we walked back toward the trailhead, strange markings caught my eye, symbols scratched into the bark of a dead mesquite tree. The etchings were jagged and crude, but unmistakably deliberate. We followed the trail cautiously, but the markings became more frequent, and the feeling of being watched intensified. Then, near a rocky outcrop, we found bones, small and bleached white. Animal bones, but not like any I'd seen before. Some had strange gnaw marks, others seemed broken, as if something had torn through them. We decided to turn back. As we hiked, the whispering returned, now all around us, urgent and pleading. Suddenly, from behind a boulder, a figure stepped into view. It was a man. No, not quite. His skin was weathered and cracked like the desert itself, eyes sunken and glowing faintly in the shade. His clothes were tattered, and he moved with an unnatural stillness. We froze. "Go back," he said, voice like gravel. We ran. We didn't stop until the trailhead was in sight, heart pounding, lungs burning. Back in town, no one believed our story. They called it heat exhaustion, hallucinations brought on by dehydration. But we knew the truth. The desert hides its own secrets, and some of them are hungry. I've never been back. Story the end. The desert stretches wide and endless, a place where silence can be your only companion, or the herald of something far worse. I learned that the hard way. My name's Jake. I'm 32, and I was born and raised in Tucson, Arizona. Growing up, I was always drawn to the desert, its harsh beauty, the way the sun would scorch the earth in the afternoon and the cold would settle in like a shroud at night. I knew the land well, and I always thought I was prepared for anything it could throw at me. But there's a side to the desert most people don't talk about. A dark, unforgiving side. In the summer of 2018, I took a job working for a pipeline maintenance company contracted to repair a broken gas line out near the remote parts of the Sonoran Desert. The place was near no man's land, miles from the nearest highway or town. I was told it was a straightforward job: drive out, assess the damage, repair the line, and report back. The company sent me out with a buddy, Mark, a guy I'd worked with before. We loaded up our truck with supplies, tools, and enough water to last several days. Our first day went smooth enough. The desert was brutal under the midday sun, but we made it to the site, found the break in the pipeline, and started the repair process. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped quickly, and the desert night settled over us like a cold blanket. We set up a small camp near the repair site, eating canned beans and jerky, and talking about our lives, our plans for the future, and the things that haunted us. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise outside our tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote or a pack rat. But the sound was different. It was a scraping noise, like something large dragging itself across the rocky ground. I nudged Mark, but he just grunted and rolled over. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing. The desert was still and quiet again. I chalked it up to nerves and went back to sleep. The next morning, we found strange tracks around the camp. Large, uneven footprints that didn't match any animal we knew. They looked almost human, but distorted, like something wrong with the feet. Mark laughed it off, but I felt uneasy. We finished the repairs that day and started to pack up. As we drove back toward the highway, I noticed that our GPS had started to glitch. The screen flickered and the signal disappeared entirely, even though we were on the main road. I told Mark, but he just said it was probably interference from the rocky terrain. We kept going. A few miles down the road, the truck suddenly stalled. We tried everything, but it wouldn't start. The sun was sinking fast, and the desert around us seemed to grow colder. We got out to check under the hood, but as we worked, I heard that scraping noise again, closer this time. I turned around, shining my flashlight, and caught a glimpse of something moving behind the rocks. Something tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Mark didn't see it. When the truck wouldn't start, we decided to walk back toward the last town we'd passed, about 10 miles away. The desert at night is a place you don't want to be alone. The temperature plummets, and every shadow seems to hide something. We moved fast, but the terrain was rough, sharp rocks and thorny bushes. I kept hearing that noise behind us, the dragging and scraping, but whenever I looked, there was nothing. After a couple of hours, Mark suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded. That's when we saw the eyes. A pair of yellow eyes glowing in the darkness, reflecting our flashlights. There were more, dozens of them, surrounding us at the edge of the brush. We backed up slowly, but they moved closer. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was humanoid but twisted, like something out of a nightmare. Its skin was leathery and cracked, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with sharp, jagged teeth. It didn't make a sound, but stared at us with those glowing eyes. Mark screamed and ran. I was frozen, heart pounding. The thing moved too fast to follow, and Mark disappeared into the darkness. I ran after him, calling his name, but he was gone. I was alone. I walked for hours, trying to find the road. The stars were bright, but the desert seemed endless. My water ran out. My legs burned with exhaustion. Eventually, I collapsed near a cluster of mesquite trees. When I woke, the sun was high, and a search party was around me. They told me Mark was never found. I never went back to the desert after that. Sometimes at night, I still hear that scraping noise. I still see those yellow eyes in the dark. And I know that something waits out there beyond the reach of civilization, watching. Story the end. The desert is a place of extremes. Scorching heat during the day, bone-chilling cold at night, and silence so deep it presses on your mind. Most people think of it as empty, desolate, maybe even beautiful in a harsh way. But beneath that endless expanse of sand and rock, there are stories, real stories, that the desert keeps buried, hidden from the world. This is one of them. I was working as a field technician for a telecommunications company based out of Phoenix. The job wasn't glamorous, mostly just maintaining and repairing equipment at remote cell towers scattered across the desert. The work paid okay, and I liked the solitude. Being alone out there, miles from anything, it felt peaceful, at least most of the time. In late September, I was assigned to check out a new tower installation on the outskirts of the Mojave Desert, near a tiny town called Kelso. It was a dusty little place, barely on the map, and the road to the tower was a narrow dirt track that cut through miles of barren land. I was told the crew ahead of me had run into some strange issues with signal interference, and they wanted me to take a look. I loaded up my truck early one morning, the sun barely up, and headed out. The drive was long and mostly uneventful, just the truck's engine humming and the occasional caw of a raven overhead. When I arrived at the tower site around noon, the heat was already oppressive, and the landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, nothing but rocks, scrub brush, and the sharp silhouettes of distant mountains. The tower itself was impressive, tall, skeletal, with its antennae reaching into the sky like metal fingers. The equipment hut at its base was locked tight. I set down my gear, pulled out my toolkit, and started running diagnostics on the signal equipment inside. Everything seemed normal at first, but then I noticed the interference. It wasn't like typical static or signal dropout. It was more like a rhythm, a pattern repeating over and over, like a distant heartbeat. I couldn't pinpoint the source, but it was definitely coming from somewhere near the tower. I spent the afternoon climbing the tower, inspecting every connection, every cable. When I finished, I sat in the shade and drank water, wiping the sweat from my forehead. The sky was starting to shift into sunset colors, the desert glowing golden and pink. Then I heard it, a low sound, faint at first, like a hum carried on the wind. I froze. The sound wasn't mechanical, it was organic, almost a chant, though I couldn't make out words. I scanned the horizon but saw nothing. The sun dipped below the mountains and the desert grew colder fast. I packed up and started back toward the truck, but the humming grew louder, almost insistent. My skin prickled. It felt like the desert itself was speaking, trying to tell me something. I told myself it was just the wind and nerves. That night, I camped nearby, just off the dirt road. I had a small tent and plenty of water. The stars were dazzling, and the silence was nearly absolute, except for that humming, which returned, faint but steady. It seemed to come from all around, echoing off the rocks. I tried to ignore it and fell into a restless sleep. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a sharp noise, something scraping against the side of my tent. I sat up and listened, heart hammering. The sound was deliberate, slow, like nails or claws dragging across fabric. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap. There was nothing there, just the dark desert and empty air. But then I saw footprints in the sand. Not human. Too long and narrow, with elongated toes spread apart. They circled the tent, coming close enough that I could see the prints clearly in the moonlight. I shined my light around, but saw no movement. My breath came out in clouds in the cold air. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The humming started again, louder now, a deep pulsing that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I grabbed my rifle and scanned the area, but the desert was empty. I thought about leaving, but the truck was stuck a little ways back in some loose sand. I was too far out, and the night was just getting colder. I sat in the cab, lights off, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, I crawled out and looked at the footprints again. They led away into the rocks, disappearing into a narrow canyon I hadn't noticed before. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow. The canyon was narrow and twisting, the walls rising high on either side. As I walked deeper, the humming grew louder, more insistent. It felt like a voice, ancient and mournful. I found a small cave entrance, hidden behind a boulder. Inside, the air was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the desert heat outside. The walls were covered in strange carvings, symbols that looked like twisted figures and spirals. They glowed faintly in the beam of my flashlight. The humming was deafening now, vibrating through the cave floor. Then I saw them, shapes moving in the shadows. Not quite human, but not entirely animal. Tall, thin figures with elongated limbs and eyes that shone like coals. I froze. One stepped forward, raising a hand. The chanting stopped instantly. It spoke, though no sound came from its mouth. The voice echoed inside my head, old, sorrowful, warning me to leave. I stumbled backward, heart racing, and fled the cave. Back at the truck, I packed up and left without looking back. I reported my findings, mostly about the strange interference and the cave carvings. The company dismissed my story about the figures as hallucinations, but I know what I saw. Years later, I returned to the desert, but the canyon was gone. The earth had shifted, erasing any trace. Some things the desert keeps secret. Story the end. The desert stretches out in all directions, endless, barren, and unforgiving. I've driven through it dozens of times before, hauling loads between Phoenix and Las Vegas. It's a dry, blistering expanse, and though I always knew the desert could kill you, I never thought it could scare you like this. My name's Mark, and what I'm about to tell you happened in the summer of 2016. I was driving an 18-wheeler loaded with supplies destined for a small gas station outside a little town called Beatty, Nevada. I'd just finished unloading, and the sun was dipping below the horizon as I decided to take a shortcut back onto Highway 95. The road narrowed, and soon it became nothing more than gravel and dirt. I pulled over to check the map on my phone, but the signal dropped. Typical desert. I cursed and switched off the device, looking around. The wind had picked up, carrying a fine dust that brushed against my skin like a warning. I got back in the truck and started driving. After about 10 minutes, the headlights caught movement on the side of the road. I slowed and pulled over to see a man standing by the edge of the desert, waving his arms. He looked ragged, with a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. I cracked the window. "Need a ride?" He nodded and climbed in without hesitation. No bag, no explanation. Just sat there, staring ahead. "Where you headed?" I asked. "Just out past the next turn," he said, voice low and gravelly. Something about him made my skin crawl, but the desert was brutal at night, and I figured he needed help. As I drove, the man stayed silent. I stole glances, but his face was unreadable in the dim cab light. Then I noticed the smell, something sour and metallic, like blood mixed with sweat. I tried to shake it off. "You okay back there?" He didn't answer. We turned off the gravel road and onto a narrower path. The truck bounced over rocks and ruts. Then the engine sputtered. My heart sank. I pulled over, popped the hood, but couldn't find the problem. The man leaned out the window and spat on the ground, muttering something I couldn't catch. Suddenly I heard it, a soft scraping behind the truck. I spun around, but there was nothing, just darkness stretching endlessly. The man said, "It's the desert. It takes what it wants." "Who are you?" I asked. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a traveler," he said. The air grew colder, despite the heat outside. My skin prickled with unease. I tried the engine again. It started, but barely. I drove on, desperate to get back to the main highway. After a few miles, the man pointed ahead. "That's where I get off." I stopped, but when I looked back, the seat was empty. Panic surged through me. The door was locked, windows rolled up. I reached back, nothing. No sign he'd ever been there. Then I heard footsteps behind the truck. Not on the road, but in the sand. Heavy, deliberate. I jumped out and shone the flashlight into the desert. Nothing. But the footprints were there, large, dragging footprints leading away from the truck, deeper into the desert. I called the police once I got signal, but they told me no one was reported missing. No one matching the description. The next day I returned to the spot, but all I found were those footprints fading into the dunes. I never took that shortcut again. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear scraping outside my window. The desert takes what it wants. Story the end. The desert was supposed to be a place where I could disappear for a while. After my divorce, I needed a break. Somewhere far from the noise of the city, away from people and memories. A friend recommended a small remote town in southern New Mexico, near the Jornada del Muerto Basin. I'd never been there before, but he swore the silence was healing and that the night skies were like nowhere else. So I packed up my old truck, loaded camping gear, and headed out, planning to spend 2 weeks alone. The first few days were exactly what I hoped for. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, and the sun baked the earth during the day, while the stars blanketed the sky at night. I hiked along dry washes and rocky outcrops, taking photographs and journaling. The silence was complete except for the occasional call of a coyote or the rustle of wind through brittle bushes. But on the fourth night, things started to change. I was lying in my tent around midnight when I heard a faint tapping on the canvas. It was soft, rhythmic, like someone was knocking, but not hard enough to pierce the thin fabric. I sat up, heart pounding, and unzipped the door. Nothing. Just the desert, bathed in moonlight. The wind was still. No animals, no footsteps. The tapping came again, slower this time, but I still couldn't see anything. I chalked it up to nerves and went back to bed. The next day, I found strange markings on the rocks near my camp. They looked like symbols, scratches that formed patterns, some resembling circles with dots, others like arrows pointing inward. I took pictures, but the unease was growing. That night, I set up my flashlight to face the tent entrance and left it on low. Around 1 a.m., I woke to the beam catching a shadow, something standing just beyond the tent flap. I blinked, and it was gone. The tapping started again, accompanied by low, almost inaudible whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I didn't sleep. On the fifth day, I decided to hike further out, hoping distance would clear my head. As I crossed a ridge, I noticed footprints, human, but too large and irregular to be normal. The prints headed toward a dry canyon and disappeared into a narrow crevice. Curiosity won over caution, and I followed. The canyon walls narrowed until I was in a small cave opening, hidden from the sun. Inside, the air was cold, impossibly so for the desert. On the floor lay bones, animal at first glance, but some were distinctly human. Scattered among them were more of the strange symbols, carved into the rock walls and smeared with a dark, reddish substance. I felt sick. That night I heard voices, clear now, echoing through the canyon outside my tent. They spoke in a language I didn't recognize, chanting in low, rhythmic tones. The tapping on the tent became pounding, desperate. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but only shadows greeted me. On the sixth night, I awoke to the sensation of being watched. The air was thick, oppressive. I pulled back the tent flap and caught a glimpse of something standing at the edge of the camp, tall, gaunt, and almost translucent under the moonlight. It had no face, just a shifting darkness where eyes should be. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the desert. I packed up immediately and drove back to town, stopping only once when I saw a pile of stones shaped like a cairn on the side of the road, one I was sure hadn't been there before. Back in civilization, no one believed me. They told me I must have been dehydrated or hallucinating. Maybe I was. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tapping and the whispers. And I know whatever followed me from that canyon isn't done yet. Story, the end. The desert heat was suffocating as I drove west from Phoenix, Arizona, toward the vast expanse of the Sonoran Desert. My name is Ethan, a geologist by trade, sent out to survey a remote area near the border where reports of strange seismic activity had come up. I was eager for some solitude, a break from the humdrum of office life. But what I found in those endless sands was something far beyond what I expected. The drive itself was long and isolated, the highway stretching out like a ribbon into the shimmering heat waves. Around noon, the sun felt like a white-hot ball pressing down through the windshield. I made a mental note to keep my water supply close and take frequent breaks. I reached the edge of the mapped desert area by early afternoon. The last gas station was miles behind me, and from here the landscape turned rugged. Rocky outcrops jutted from the sand, and occasional scrub brush was the only sign of life. I pulled off the road near a dry wash, an ancient riverbed that had not seen water for decades, and began unpacking my gear. The air was dry, but the heat radiating from the ground was intense. I set up my tent and prepared my equipment for the days ahead. As the sun began to set, I noticed the temperature dropping rapidly. In the desert, that was normal. But there was something else. An eerie stillness settled over the land, as if the desert was holding its breath. I was out near a small ridge taking samples of the rocky soil when I first heard it, a distant humming, low and vibrating through the air, almost imperceptible. It was nothing like the usual wind or the distant sound of wildlife. It seemed unnatural. I paused and listened. The humming grew louder, almost like a mechanical drone, but there was no visible source. I scanned the horizon with binoculars, but saw nothing. As darkness fell, the humming stopped abruptly. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the faint crackle of my campfire. That night, I had restless dreams, visions of shadowy figures moving just beyond the edge of the firelight, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I woke sweating, the air thick with an unnatural cold despite the desert night. Outside my tent, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing. Just as I was about to close the tent, I caught a glimpse of something. A pale figure standing motionless behind a cactus, its eyes reflecting the flashlight like molten glass. My heart nearly stopped. I blinked, and it was gone. The next day, I found strange markings on the rocks near my camp. Symbols etched deep, unlike anything I'd seen before. They looked ancient but fresh, almost as if carved last night. I took photos and tried to research them on my satellite phone, but there was no signal. I decided to hike toward a nearby abandoned mining town, hoping to find someone or some clue. The town was a skeleton of its former self, collapsed buildings, rusted machinery, and shattered windows staring like dead eyes. As I explored, I found a journal lying on a broken table inside what used to be the general store. The pages were yellowed but readable. It told the story of a mining crew that had vanished decades ago, leaving no trace but strange symbols and whispered warnings about something lurking beneath the sands. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The humming returned, this time louder, seeming to emanate from underground. Suddenly, the ground beneath me trembled. I stumbled and caught myself as the earth rumbled again. From the darkness of a nearby mine shaft came a deep, guttural growl. I didn't wait to investigate. I ran back to my truck, heart pounding, the hairs on the back of my neck standing tall. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and thought I saw a shadow standing in the entrance of the mine, watching me leave. That night, I checked into a motel back in town, but the nightmare followed. At midnight, my phone buzzed with a message. Just a single word: return. The lights flickered. A cold breeze swept through the room, even though the window was shut. I locked the door and sat on the bed, adrenaline coursing. Suddenly, the humming filled the room, low and insistent, growing louder and louder until it felt like my skull might split. And then, it stopped. The next morning, I packed and left the desert behind. I never returned to that cursed place. Some places in the desert are better left alone. Story the end. The sun had barely risen when Emma pulled her old Jeep onto the dusty shoulder of the highway cutting through the Sonoran Desert. She was alone, like she preferred. No distractions, no noise except the whisper of wind over the parched earth. Her plan was simple: spend a few days off-grid, hiking and camping near the Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, photographing the vast stretches of cacti and rugged mountains. She needed to disconnect from the city and from the mounting stress of her job in Phoenix. Her Jeep rattled as she turned off the paved road and onto a narrow dirt path. The tires kicked up clouds of red dust that hung in the still morning air. She checked her supplies one last time: water, food, camera gear, emergency kit, all in order. The only thing she felt was a quiet excitement. She drove slowly, eyes scanning the barren landscape dotted with giant saguaro and ocotillo plants. The desert was waking up. A few birds called in the distance, and somewhere a roadrunner dashed across the sand. Emma parked near a small wash where she planned to set up her camp. The spot was tucked between two low hills, sheltered from the worst of the wind. She unloaded her gear, setting up a modest tent, then took a deep breath of the dry, earthy air. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The first day passed uneventfully. Emma wandered along the trails, capturing the desert's stark beauty through her lens. She marveled at the contrast between the harsh environment and the delicate blooms of desert wildflowers. By evening, she had a fire going and cooked a simple meal, watching the sky turn a fiery orange as the sun set behind the mountains. That night, the desert air grew cold. Emma zipped up her sleeping bag and listened to the quiet, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl. Somewhere nearby, coyotes howled, a haunting, eerie sound that sent a chill down her spine, but also reminded her of the wildness around her. The second day started with a light breeze and clouds creeping in, unusual for this time of year. Emma set out on a longer hike, moving deeper into the desert than before. She passed strange rock formations and ancient petroglyphs etched into stone walls, remnants of people who had lived here centuries ago. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, she noticed something odd. The desert seemed darker, the shadows longer and colder than she expected. She paused near a dry creek bed, looking out over a valley where the wind stirred the sand into miniature whirlwinds. Then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound, like something knocking on stone or metal. She looked around but saw nothing. The sound stopped. Emma shrugged, chalking it up to the desert's natural noises, and continued on. She was hiking back till it disappeared behind a thick bank of clouds, and the temperature dropped rapidly. The sky darkened, turning a slate gray. The wind picked up, whipping her hair and tearing at the edges of her jacket. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the canyon. A gunshot? She froze, heart pounding. The desert around her felt alive with unseen eyes. The tapping sound started again, this time faster and more insistent. Emma scanned the rocky cliffs and saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. She started walking faster, trying to put distance between herself and the eerie noises. The trail grew rougher, less familiar. She pulled out her phone to check GPS, but only found no signal. Her pulse quickened. The tapping changed rhythm again, no longer steady knocks, but something uneven like footsteps behind her, crunching on gravel. Emma dared not look back. She broke into a run, breath ragged, heart pounding. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, and the twilight thickened. Ahead, a faint light flickered. Maybe her campfire? As she raced forward, the footsteps quickened too, matching her pace, but never crossing into sight. She stumbled and fell into a patch of cactus needles, with pain shooting through her leg. The footsteps stopped. Silence. She looked up and saw a figure emerging from the shadows. Tall, thin, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It didn't speak, but reached out with skeletal fingers. Emma scrambled back, dragging herself toward the light of her campfire. The figure hesitated and then vanished into the night like smoke. Emma collapsed near the fire, tears streaming, shaking. She packed hastily and decided to leave at first light. But when dawn came, the Jeep wouldn't start. The battery was dead. Her phone still had no signal. Panic crept in. She tried the fire again, but it barely caught. The desert heat rose, relentless and unforgiving. As the sun climbed, Emma felt eyes on her again, watching from the rocky outcrops, the cacti, the shadows between stones. She realized she wasn't alone in the desert. That night, the tapping returned louder and closer. The glowing eyes appeared again and again at the edge of her camp. She whispered prayers, tried to stay awake. At dawn, she found footprints in the sand around her tent, too large, too deep for any animal she knew. She packed whatever she could carry and started walking toward the highway, hoping for rescue. Days later, a ranger found Emma near the roadside, delirious, dehydrated, and with scratches all over her arms. She told a story of shadows and eyes in the desert, of tapping sounds and a feeling of being hunted. The ranger listened carefully but said nothing about the desert's darker legends, the spirits that haunt the land, those who vanished without a trace over the decades. Emma never returned to the desert, but sometimes at night she hears tapping on her window, soft, rhythmic, as if a reminder that the desert never forgets those who wander too far. Story, the end. The desert was supposed to be a break, a weekend away from the noise and pressure of city life. I thought I'd find some quiet out there, some peace to sort my thoughts. I didn't expect to come back with a story that would haunt me for years. My name's Kevin, and I work in construction management in Southern California. I'm used to stress, deadlines, and demanding bosses. When my friend Tyler invited me out for a weekend camping trip in the Mojave Desert, I jumped at the chance. Tyler had been a wilderness guide years ago and swore he knew a spot off the beaten path where no one ever went. Total isolation, he promised. No cell service, no crowds, just the stars and the silence. We planned it for mid-October when the heat would be bearable and the nights cool. Tyler mapped out the drive, about 2 hours from Los Angeles, deep into the desert near the El Mirage dry lake bed. It was a place famous for land speed records and off-road racing, but Tyler's spot was several miles beyond the usual trails. We left Friday morning before dawn, packed with gear, water, and enough food to last 3 days. The drive was uneventful, highway fading into dirt roads and rocky tracks. Our truck rumbled over cracked earth and sand until we pulled off near a cluster of twisted Joshua trees, the landscape stretching flat and empty around us. The silence hit first. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a forest or the gentle hush of a lake shore. It was a vacuum, like the world had pressed pause. The wind barely moved, and even the birds were absent. We set up camp in a small hollow just off the dry lake bed, with a view of the mountains that rose jagged against the horizon. Tyler built a fire and we settled in, talking about work, life, and the usual distractions. That night, the stars exploded overhead, millions of them, glittering cold and distant. It was the kind of sky you never see in the city. I felt a flicker of calm I hadn't felt in months. Around midnight, I woke to a strange noise. At first, it was subtle, a faint scraping, like claws dragging on rock. I sat up and shone my flashlight toward the edge of the camp. Nothing. Tyler was still asleep, snoring softly. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The sound came again, closer now. A low, rasping breath, almost like a hiss. I scanned the darkness beyond the trees. The desert looked empty, but something was out there. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the trees, tall and thin, shrouded in shadows. Its eyes caught the light from my flashlight, reflecting back with an eerie glow. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. I whispered Tyler's name. No response. Summoning my courage, I grabbed a nearby stick and poked at the ground where the figure stood. The dirt was disturbed. Deep footprints, uneven and large, like something between human and animal. The figure vanished. The next morning I tried to shake it off, blaming the dark, the loneliness, maybe a trick of the light. We packed up and went for a hike along a dry wash. The air was cooler, the wind picking up. Tyler pointed out some animal tracks. Coyote, bobcat, but none matched the prints from the night before. As we climbed a ridge, we spotted a cluster of old ruins, wooden beams and stone foundations barely holding up against the desert. Tyler said it was an abandoned mining outpost from the early 1900s. People had lived and worked here, but the harsh conditions drove them away. Nearby, scratched into the rock, were strange symbols. They looked ancient, some kind of writing or markings, but I didn't recognize them. That afternoon, as we made our way back to camp, the desert seemed to close in. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the temperature dropped despite the sun. Suddenly, a scream shattered the silence. It was Tyler's voice, sharp and terrified. I spun around and saw him pointing at a spot near the ruins. Something was moving there, a shadowy shape, low to the ground, but fast. It darted between rocks, almost disappearing. I called out to Tyler, but he shook his head. "It's watching us," he said, voice shaking. We hurried back to camp, packing our gear in a rush. That night the fire wouldn't light. Matches went out before a spark could catch. We huddled together, listening to the desert's breathing. Around midnight the noise returned, this time closer, circling the camp. A scraping, a dragging, a whispering breath. I shone the flashlight into the dark. The figure was there, just beyond the firelight. Taller now, limbs twisted like branches, skin pale and cracked. Its eyes burned like holes. Tyler grabbed my arm. "Run," he whispered. We took off, stumbling over rocks and cactus, the desert a blur around us. Behind us, the creature's cries echoed, a mixture of human agony and animal fury. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. The engine roared to life, tires spinning in the sand. We drove straight through the night, not looking back. I haven't been back to the desert since. Sometimes when the wind blows just right, I hear that rasping breath in the city. And I know whatever it was is still out there, waiting. Story the end. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the last of its orange glow spread like a bloodstain across the vast Mojave sky. I was behind the wheel of my 2006 Toyota Tacoma, alone on a desolate 2-lane road, somewhere east of Barstow, California. I was trying to make it out to a remote site where I'd agreed to meet a man named Derek for a freelance drone gig. Nothing fancy, just some aerial footage of an abandoned military airstrip that his YouTube followers were obsessed with. The map coordinates he gave me didn't even point to a town, just a patch of nothing in the desert. No cell reception, no towns for 30 miles, and barely a radio signal. But the money was good, and I'd done weirder jobs. By the time I hit the dirt turnoff, dusk had completely surrendered to night. The truck's high beams stretched only so far into the black. Everything beyond them, the desert scrub, the low ridges, and distant silhouettes of Joshua trees, just melted into shadow. I drove slowly over the uneven path, tires crunching rock and bone-dry soil. I arrived at the coordinates just after 8:30. No buildings. Just an old, rusted hangar-like structure half sunken into the ground, surrounded by sand and wind-scoured fencing. Derek's truck wasn't there. At first I thought I might have beaten him, but after 20 minutes of waiting and calling out into the dark, I started to feel uneasy. There was no wind, no movement, and no sound except the occasional popping from my truck's cooling engine. I shut off the headlights to conserve battery and immediately regretted it. Darkness collapsed over me like a shroud. It was the kind of dark that made your brain conjure things, shapes, movement, whispering that wasn't real. I turned the lights back on, just low beams this time, and stepped out. I called out Derek's name again, my voice sounding too loud and hollow in the open air. Still nothing. I figured I'd take a quick walk around the hangar, maybe find a sign that he'd already been here. Tire tracks, a water bottle, anything. The structure was maybe 60 feet across, made of weathered metal and riveted panels. It looked more like a bunker than anything to do with aviation. A warped sliding door sat ajar on one side, enough for a man to squeeze through. I walked toward it, boots crunching in the gravel and loose sand, flashlight in hand. Just as I was a few feet from the door, I noticed something peculiar. Scratches on the metal, not graffiti or tags. Deep, erratic gouges. Some had a pattern like claws, or someone trying to dig into the metal from the outside. I stopped and listened. Nothing. I pushed the door and it slid open with a dry metallic scream. The inside smelled like old oil and dust. My flashlight beam cut across empty space, broken crates, and a long-dead generator. Nothing seemed out of place. But as I scanned the far wall, something moved. I froze. It had been fast, barely in my periphery. A human-sized shadow ducking behind a stack of crates. I shined my light there and called out again, "Derek?" No answer. My voice echoed back in the stale air. I crept forward, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. "Hey, this isn't funny, man." Still no answer. When I got to the crates, I found nothing. No one. No footprints. Nothing disturbed. But the air felt different, thicker, like humidity that shouldn't exist in a desert hangar. Then a sound, a dry clicking noise, like nails tapping against metal. I turned quickly and pointed the light back toward the door. Nothing. But the clicking came again, this time behind me. I whipped around and still saw nothing. My heartbeat accelerated. I didn't wait to investigate further. I backed out, trying to keep the light steady. The moment I cleared the threshold, I slammed the door shut and jogged back to the truck. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there in silence for a long time. There was still no signal. I debated turning around and leaving, but I didn't want to bail on a paying job. Stupid, maybe. Pride? Definitely. I grabbed my drone case, set it on the hood, and began assembling it. The plan was simple. Launch, grab footage of the hangar from above, and maybe do some infrared or night vision shots around the perimeter. The drone lifted into the night sky with a soft mechanical hum. The live feed beamed back to my screen, showing the hangar from above, then sweeping in wide circles to capture the surrounding desert. Everything looked normal at first, but then I noticed something strange near the base of a hill to the north. A dark shape was moving against the paler sand. I zoomed in. It wasn't Derek. It was wrong. The shape was humanoid, yes, but unnaturally elongated. The limbs bent oddly, especially the legs, which seemed to curve backward at the knee like a dog's. It had no clothes. Its skin, if that's what it was ash gray and almost leathery, stretched tight. It was walking toward the hangar. I panned the drone to follow it, and the thing stopped. Then its head, or what I assumed was its head, snapped up, right at the drone, at me. The feed glitched. The screen cut to static, then to black. The drone had dropped out of the sky. I cursed under my breath and grabbed my flashlight again, hesitating by the truck. I scanned the darkness in the direction where I'd last seen the figure. Nothing. But I no longer felt alone. I climbed into the truck, locked the doors again, and debated my options. It was stupid to stay, and I knew it. Whatever was out there, it wasn't natural. If Derek was here, he was either hiding or worse. Still, I didn't want to leave without trying once more. I turned the key and the engine whined, then clicked, but it didn't start. Another turn. Still nothing. Battery was fine, lights were still on, but the engine wouldn't kick over. That's when I heard it, scratching. Very faint. On the passenger side door, I leaned slowly to look out the window. My own reflection stared back at me, nothing else. But the scratching came again, louder. Then a second sound, something heavy landing on the roof. A dull thud, followed by dragging. I froze. Another thud. The truck rocked slightly. I couldn't see anything out the windows except the dirt and the night. Then I heard the clicking again. The nails. This time directly above me. My skin went cold. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then silence. A full minute passed. Then another. I reached slowly toward the ignition, turned the key again. The engine roared to life. I slammed it into drive and hit the gas, spinning out in the dirt before the tires caught. I didn't care about the gear, the drone, or the job. I just wanted out. As I peeled down the dirt road, headlights shaking with every bump, I glanced in the rear view. A shape stood in the distance. Still. Watching. I didn't stop again until I reached the highway. When I finally got signal, I tried to call Derek. No answer. I called the sheriff's office and reported him missing. I gave them the coordinates and everything I knew. They said they'd send someone out the next morning. I didn't sleep that night. I kept imagining the thing on my roof, the clicking, the way it had looked into the drone, the way it had known where I was. A week later, I got a call. They'd found Derek's truck. Empty. Parked in a wash a few miles from the hangar. No sign of him. They also found the drone, shattered in pieces, as if it had been torn apart mid-air. The footage was gone. The official story was exposure. People get lost out there all the time, the deputy told me. You wouldn't believe how quickly the desert takes people. But I know what I saw. And sometimes in the deepest parts of the night, I still hear that clicking sound, even when there's nothing around but walls. I've never gone back. Story the end. Darren Sloan wasn't the reckless type. He didn't take chances without a plan, and even when he did something out of the ordinary, he'd run it through a checklist like a NASA engineer. So when he told his coworkers at the Phoenix civil engineering firm that he was taking off for a solo weekend in the Mojave Desert to clear his head, most of them blinked in surprise. It wasn't that he wasn't capable. He'd camped solo before, hiked parts of the Sierra Nevada, and had even gone on a snowshoe trek in Utah. But there was something different in his voice this time. Something uncertain. He'd said it was for clarity, but it sounded more like escape. Darren's recent months had been rough. His brother, Kyle, had died in a car accident just 3 months earlier. No drugs, no alcohol, just a sharp bend and a distracted driver coming the other way. They'd been close. Grew up sharing bunk beds, shared their first car, even went to the same college. Losing Kyle had taken something fundamental out of Darren, like a gear slipping loose in his inner mechanism. He left on a Friday afternoon in early May, just as the heat began to reach its sharp, relentless pitch in Arizona. He drove west in his Jeep Cherokee, AC blasting, a metal water jug on the seat beside him, his backpack loaded with enough provisions to survive 3 days. Tent, check. Satellite phone, check. Extra gas, flares, solar charger, maps, GPS, knife, sidearm, all checked and triple checked. He had picked a part of the Mojave that few campers or tourists went near, a stretch of craggy reddish hills northwest of Needles, California. Most people avoided the place, not because of danger, but because there was nothing to see. No train, no trails, no historical markers, no striking vistas. Just parched hills, dry washes, and rust-colored rock. That was what Darren wanted. Something silent, vacant, utterly indifferent to his presence. He parked the Jeep near a dry gulch, a few hundred yards from an outcropping of jagged stone that almost looked like ancient ruins from a distance. No cell signal, as expected. He pitched his tent, got the small fire ring set up, and sat down on a folding chair with a lukewarm can of beer, watching the sun settle behind the horizon in that rapid, brutal way it does in the desert. The wind was still warm, brushing dust past his boots. The silence stretched in all directions. That first night, he slept deeply, almost unnaturally. The kind of sleep that comes only when your body surrenders to something larger than rest, exhaustion, grief, or some primal, unidentifiable weight. The second day, he hiked the ridges near the rock formations. He took photos, though they all looked the same, muted, beige, heat-hazed. Around mid-afternoon, he stopped for lunch and found a curious indentation in the dirt, half covered by sand and brittle weeds. It wasn't quite a footprint, at least not one he recognized. It looked like a three-toed impression, deep and evenly shaped, like a bird's talon but human-sized. He stared at it for several minutes, then dismissed it as a natural formation or the work of erosion. He had no interest in desert cryptids or ghost stories. He was here to be alone. But later that evening, as the wind picked up and the fire sputtered low, he noticed something odd. The air shifted, not just in temperature but in pressure. It was subtle at first, like stepping into a room where someone had just left, the kind of presence you felt more than saw. He looked around, suddenly aware of how dark it had gotten. The moon was thin, a sliver of dull silver above the ridge. The rocks seemed taller now, looming. The silence felt tighter. Then came the sound, soft, dragging, rhythmic, like something being pulled through the sand. It came from behind his tent, maybe 15 yards out. He froze, fingers tightening around the flashlight in his lap. He turned it on, swept the beam toward the sound. Nothing, just empty desert. He waited a few more minutes before climbing into the tent, locking the zipper and placing his sidearm within reach. It was probably an animal, he told himself. A coyote dragging a kill, maybe a lizard, maybe the wind shifting debris. But something about the pattern of it, methodical, deliberate, stayed in his mind long after he closed his eyes. The third day began heavy. He woke feeling like he hadn't slept at all, head throbbing, mouth dry even after gulping water. He stepped out of the tent and noticed tracks, those same three-pronged impressions, only clearer now. They started near the back of his tent and trailed off toward the rocks. He crouched down to study them. They were too uniform, too deep. Not bird tracks. Not any animal he recognized. Darren's rational mind struggled to assert itself. He had no intention of becoming one of those people. Conspiracy theorists, desert weirdos who sent blurry photos to fringe magazines. But he couldn't deny what he saw. He packed quickly that day, stuffing his gear into the Jeep with a rising urgency. Something felt off. The air, the heat, the way the light seemed thinner somehow, as if the desert was holding its breath. He started the engine, drove fast over the bumpy trail that led back toward the service road. He checked his GPS. It flickered once, then returned to normal. A glitch, nothing more. But then it flickered again, then shut off entirely. The screen went black. He slowed, frowning, and reached for his backup map. When he looked up again, he slammed on the brakes. There was a figure standing on the path about 20 yards ahead. At first he thought it was a man, but it wasn't. It stood too still, too narrow, its limbs long and thin like bone under tight skin. It had no clothing, no face that he could make out, and its head tilted unnaturally to one side, as if listening. Darren's breath locked in his chest. He blinked, and it was gone. He sat there, the engine idling, dust circling the vehicle. He wasn't sure if it had moved or if it had never been there at all. He pressed the gas and drove faster, jostling hard over rocks and dips until the Jeep jolted violently. A tire had blown. He cursed, got out, hand on his sidearm, and went around to the passenger side. Sure enough, the front right tire was torn. Not just punctured, but ripped clean in two. Not shredded like on glass or rock, but sliced in one clean gash. He changed it quickly, sweat pouring down his back despite the dry wind. Every time he looked up, he expected to see something standing there, watching. But the desert was still, just heat and stone and sky. He finally reached the service road near sunset. From there, it was another hour to the highway, and then civilization. But he didn't go home. For reasons he still doesn't understand, Darren stopped in a small town near the California border, a place called Emery's Wash, population maybe 200. He got a room at the only motel, a squat, cinder block building with green trim and buzzing yellow lights. He told himself it was just to sleep. Just for one night. The man at the front desk was elderly, with milky eyes and cracked lips. He barely spoke, just handed over the key and nodded. The room was clean enough, though stale with dust and desert air. Darren closed the curtains, locked the door, and collapsed onto the bed. He dreamed that night, not of the desert, but of something underneath it. A chamber, vast and hollow, filled with shapes that swayed and whispered. Not voices exactly, but impressions, cold, endless, crawling through sand like oil. He woke with a start, throat dry, heart racing. The bathroom mirror was fogged, even though he hadn't showered. And on the glass, written in long, clawed strokes, were 3 lines that crisscrossed each other like a symbol. 3 prongs, just like the footprints. He left before sunrise, didn't speak to the clerk, didn't look back. When he got home, he threw away all his camping gear, sold the Jeep a week later, started working remotely. Never left the city limits again. Darren never told anyone the full story. He hinted at strange things, offhand comments during drinks or in passing conversation, but he never returned to the desert. Not once. And sometimes late at night, he still hears it, just beneath the noise of the city, just beyond the walls of his apartment, the dragging sound, soft and rhythmic, coming closer. Story the end. Jason had been driving trucks for nearly 2 decades, logging thousands of miles across the American Southwest. The desert routes were nothing new to him, but the endless monotony of sand and heat never failed to mess with his head. Over time, he'd come to respect the desert's raw power and unforgiving nature. It was a vast, silent place that swallowed the careless whole. The job he took in early July was supposed to be routine: haul a load of mining equipment from Phoenix, Arizona to a remote site near Death Valley, California. The company warned him that cell service would be unreliable once he left the highway, but Jason was confident. He'd made this run before. He left Phoenix just after dawn, the sky clear and the sun already beating down hard. The rig was heavy with gear, the tires crunching gravel as he exited the interstate onto a narrow dirt road winding into the desert. The air smelled of dust and creosote, and the heat shimmered above the earth. Hours passed with little traffic, just the hum of the engine and the occasional call from truckers on the CB radio. Then, somewhere near a small outcrop of rocky hills, the truck began to sputter. Jason eased onto the shoulder and tried to restart the engine. It died cold. He popped the hood, wiping sweat from his brow. The engine was silent, and no matter what he tried, it wouldn't turn over. His phone showed no service, and the radio was dead. Jason grabbed his emergency kit and a gallon of water, deciding to hike toward what he hoped was a service station marked on his old paper map several miles back the way he'd come. The desert stretched endlessly around him, dry, cracked earth dotted with cacti and sparse shrubs. The sun was merciless, climbing higher and hotter with every step. Hours into the hike, Jason felt his water running low. The heat was oppressive. He stopped under a lone mesquite tree to rest, his shirt soaked with sweat, heart hammering. As he caught his breath, a faint sound drifted to his ears, soft tapping, rhythmic, like a hammer against stone. He scanned the horizon, but saw nothing except the shimmering air. The tapping grew louder, echoing strangely. Suddenly, a dry wind stirred, carrying whispers that sounded like distant voices speaking in an unfamiliar language. Jason's stomach twisted. He looked back the way he'd come. The road was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the landscape had changed. The hills appeared closer, the shadows darker. Panic rising, he turned forward and continued walking, but the terrain felt off. The rocks around him seemed jagged and unnatural, and the air grew unnervingly cold despite the heat of the day. Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught movement, a pale figure standing motionless among the rocks, eyes black voids staring at him. Jason blinked. The figure was gone. His pace quickened. The tapping followed, steady now, surrounding him. As twilight descended, he stumbled upon an abandoned shack nestled against a rock face. The door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. On a rickety table lay an old leather-bound journal and a tarnished tin box. Jason flipped through the journal. It belonged to a miner from the 1930s, detailing days spent digging for ore and nights plagued by strange shadows and ghostly figures with empty eyes that watched from the darkness. One entry warned, "The desert keeps what it takes. Beware the watchers." A sudden chill ran down Jason's spine. Outside, the tapping returned, closer, more insistent. He grabbed the tin box and hurried outside. Moonlight revealed several pale, gaunt figures encircling the shack, their faces hollow and eyes black. Jason stumbled backward, heart pounding. He ran toward the desert, but the landscape twisted, dunes rising like waves, swallowing the path behind him. The figures followed silently, their eyes never leaving him. Exhausted, Jason collapsed near a rocky outcrop. At dawn, rescue teams found his journal and the empty tin box. Jason was never seen again. The desert holds many secrets, some that refuse to be uncovered. Story the end. It started with a map. A friend of mine, Jake, found it at a roadside flea market outside Tucson. He was the kind of guy who loved obscure adventure, collecting old maps and documents that hinted at forgotten mines or ghost towns. This one was hand-drawn, yellowed with age, with markings in a style that didn't quite look Navajo or Apache, more like a personal code or someone's private notation. The seller told him it was found in an abandoned shack near the edge of the Sonoran Desert, far from any marked roads. Jake was grinning like a kid when he showed it to me. "You ever hear of Dead Horse Mesa?" he asked. "No, sounds like a ghost town." Exactly. No references online, not a single mention on Google Earth. Nothing. But this map points to it. I should have said no. But it was the middle of summer, I was on a break between jobs, and the idea of uncovering something hidden out in the desert seemed better than sitting in my tiny swamp-cooled apartment. We loaded up Jake's old Tacoma with water, supplies, a tent, some gear, and headed out 2 days later. We told no one exactly where we were going, just a general direction west of Ajo. We followed the map, which had no modern references, only natural landmarks. Old riverbeds, a split-tooth rock formation that looked like a broken jawbone. We followed a dirt path that became a trail that became nothing at all. After a full day of travel, we reached a high bluff with a view of a small plateau below. That's when we saw it. At first glance, it was just a collection of sun-baked adobe walls half swallowed by the sand. But as we got closer, you could see that someone had built a little town here, maybe a dozen crumbling buildings in a grid layout. The structures were strange. They didn't follow the typical design of Old West towns, and the layout wasn't centered around a main street or water source. It was more like they'd been arranged in a circle, with something at the center, a pit or a well maybe. We camped on the edge of town, under the lean shadow of a rock spire. That first night it was quiet. No animals, no bugs, just the wind and the creaking of our tent straps. It should have been peaceful. But something about the silence had an edge to it, like holding your breath before something snaps. Jake wanted to explore the pit first thing the next morning. We had to clear away debris, weathered wood beams that had collapsed inward over the years. The pit was about 10 feet across and deeper than we expected. Jake dropped a small stone, and we never heard it hit the bottom. No echo. Just swallowed by blackness. "Probably a dry well," I said. Jake looked at the markings around the rim. Strange symbols carved into the stone, not letters, not anything I recognized. "They're almost teeth," he said. I didn't like how he said that. We explored the rest of the town. One building still had remnants of furniture, tables, cots, even a half-burnt blanket. No personal belongings, though. No books, pictures, tools, nothing that told us who had lived there. In one room, we found hundreds of small animal bones piled in a corner, sorted by size. None of them had heads. That night, the desert changed. The wind didn't sound like wind anymore. It had a rhythm, a cadence, like whispering. I got up to relieve myself and noticed something on the bluff above camp. A figure. Tall, thin, motionless. I thought maybe it was a saguaro, but when I looked again, it was gone. Jake hadn't slept. He was sitting by the cold fire pit, eyes locked on the darkness beyond our camp. "You saw it too," he said. "I thought it was a cactus." He shook his head slowly. "It watches from up there. Has for hours. We tried to joke about it, dismiss it as nerves or tricks of the desert light, but neither of us believed that. The next day, Jake wanted to descend the pit. He'd brought climbing gear, and he rigged a rope system anchored to an old beam. I begged him not to go down. Everything about that place was wrong, but he wouldn't listen. "I won't go far." "Just a few minutes," he said. I held the rope, heart pounding. He disappeared below the rim, and I watched the rope pay out. 40 feet, 50, then it stopped. "Jake," I called out, no answer. I shouted again, louder. Then the rope jerked violently. I dropped to the ground, bracing myself, pulling on the rope, but it had slack. Too much slack, like it wasn't anchored to anything anymore. I pulled until it came free entirely. Just the end of the rope, frayed, torn, not cut. I screamed his name into the pit. No echo. I don't remember climbing back to camp. I was crying. I left the tent, the gear, everything. Just took my pack and ran toward the bluff, then kept going, using the sun and the stars to guide me. I walked for hours until I collapsed from heat and exhaustion. I woke up the next day in a dry wash, lips cracked, skin burned. I followed the wash until I found a dirt road and flagged down a trucker hauling cattle. I told the police everything. They didn't believe me. Search teams found nothing. No ghost town, no pit, no evidence we'd ever been there. Just tire tracks in the desert that ended in a dried-up arroyo. They said I must have imagined it, suffered heat stroke. They checked the coordinates I gave them. There was nothing there. I still have a photo on my phone that Jake took before he went down the pit. It's blurry, sun-washed, but you can see the town in the background. Adobe walls curved into that strange circle. In the center, the dark pit. And standing near the edge of the well, almost hidden by shadow, is a figure, not Jake, too tall, too thin, limbs too long. I tried to enhance it once, tried to lighten the shadows, but every time I do, the file corrupts. I moved back east after that, got a desk job, settled down. But the desert doesn't let you go, not really. Sometimes I wake in the night, dry-mouthed, hearing wind whispering against my window in that same cadence. Sometimes I see that shape in the corner of my dreams, tall, waiting. I haven't been back. I won't go back. But sometimes I wonder if Jake ever really fell, or if something pulled him in. I got a package last month, no return address. Inside was the map. It had new markings on it, fresh ink. Story the end. It was the summer of 2013 when I got a job offer to assist with geological surveying in southeastern California, close to the Arizona border. It was temporary work, good pay, and best of all, remote, just the way I liked it. The area we were surveying was a vast stretch of desert, part of the Sonoran, stretching in every direction like an empty canvas of heat and silence. My team was small, just me, a guy named Curtis who ran data logging, and Maria, our field coordinator. We were supposed to camp in the area for 2 weeks while collecting samples and mapping out areas of interest. We arrived in a battered government SUV, loaded down with our tents, gear, and equipment. We set up camp near a small rise of jagged rocks that locals called El Sapo, the toad, because it looked like a hunched amphibian from a distance. The nearest paved road was about 30 miles away. No cell service, no nearby towns, no people. Just wind, sand, and silence. The first few days went smoothly. We kept to our schedules, rose early to avoid the worst heat, and tried to stick together, especially during hikes. It was on the fourth night that things started to shift. Curtis had been up late that evening, finishing up some readings by lamplight. I'd gone to bed around 10, bone-tired, and vaguely remember hearing him zipping up his tent about an hour later. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it might be Curtis or Maria heading out to relieve themselves. The desert amplifies sound strangely. Sometimes it feels like someone's walking right next to you when they're really 10 feet away. But this was different. The footsteps circled my tent. Once, then again, then stopped. I held my breath. The crunch of sand was so close it felt like whoever it was could touch the tent walls if they leaned in. I quietly reached for the pocket knife I kept by my sleeping bag. Then, nothing. Total silence. I must have stayed awake for another hour, ears straining, but whoever it was never returned. The next morning, I casually asked Curtis and Maria if either of them had been out during the night. Didn't even wake up once, Curtis said, sipping his coffee. Maria shook her head. You okay? I nodded, not wanting to seem paranoid. Maybe a coyote had wandered close. Maybe I dreamed it. But over the next 2 nights, it happened again. Same time, roughly between 2 and 3 in the morning. Soft footsteps, circling. Sometimes fast, like someone pacing in irritation. Sometimes slow, dragging almost, like someone drunk or injured. On the third night, I unzipped the tent just fast enough to peek out with my flashlight, but there was nothing. Just empty desert, my light beam catching nothing but brush and shifting sand. I decided to tell Curtis and Maria the next morning, expecting to get ribbed for freaking out. I heard it too, Maria said, dead serious. Last night, I thought maybe you or Curtis couldn't sleep. Curtis went pale. Okay, now it's not funny. I saw something out there. What do you mean? I asked. Last night, I thought I saw someone standing by the rocks. Just a shape. Looked like a guy, maybe. But tall. Too tall. Didn't move. I blinked and it was gone. After that, we started sticking close together even at night. We moved our tents into a tight triangle, kept the lantern on longer, and even took turns staying up a bit later just to feel safer. It didn't help. That night, something knocked over the equipment case. It weighed over 40 pounds and had been tucked under the folding table. We found it 6 feet away, half buried in sand. No tracks leading to or from it. Then we started hearing the whispers. At first, I thought it was wind, or maybe Curtis and Maria talking. But the voices came from different directions, too far apart and too low to make sense. Faint murmurs, always just beyond clarity, like someone trying to speak through a wall of glass. We searched the area the next morning for signs of anyone nearby. Nothing, no tire marks, no footprints, not even animal scat. The day after, Maria suggested we cut the job short. "We've got enough data," she said. "No reason to stay out here if it's messing with our heads." Curtis agreed. I didn't argue. That afternoon, we started packing. Maria went to collect some final notes near a dry wash about a quarter mile from camp. She took the GPS, just in case. 20 minutes passed, then 40. Curtis and I looked at each other. "I'll go find her," I said, already grabbing my boots. I walked the marked path, calling her name. Nothing. The desert was deathly silent. The wind had died down completely. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. I found the wash. I found the rock where she'd said she'd be. I found her notebook, open, pages fluttering, but Maria was gone. No footprints leading away. Just one set walking to the rock. We called out for over an hour, walked the perimeter, fired our flare, nothing. The sun started to dip, and we knew we had to get back to camp before night. Curtis didn't sleep that night, neither did I. We just sat by the lantern, taking turns scanning the desert. At around 3 a.m, the whispers came again. Louder now. Urgent. They weren't all around us anymore. They were coming from one direction. The rocks. "El Sapo," Curtis whispered. She said she felt weird there. Said it smelled like rot. I didn't want to check, but neither of us could shake the feeling she was out there. So, against every rational thought, we grabbed our lights and headed to the rocks. The closer we got, the more the air felt wrong. It was heavy, oppressive, like standing in a basement full of mold. The rocks themselves, cold to the touch, even though it had been a 100-degree day. Then we saw her. Maria was standing at the base of the largest boulder, barefoot, staring up at the sky. She didn't respond to our calls. We ran to her, grabbed her arms, pulled her back. She didn't fight, but she didn't speak either. We got her back to camp. Her skin was cold, clammy. She stared into the middle distance like she was in a trance. We packed everything in record time and loaded her into the SUV. The first 10 miles were rough, off-road and uneven, but once we hit a trail leading back to pavement, I gunned it. Maria still hadn't said a word. Curtis was up front, constantly checking on her in the rear view. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "What?" "Voices, behind us." I checked the mirrors. Nothing, just desert, fading behind us. We made it to a gas station near Blythe. Maria had started mumbling by then. Just fragments. I saw it. "Don't go back." It wasn't human. We got her to the hospital. They kept her under observation, ran tests. They thought maybe heat stroke or shock, but she never gave them a clear answer about what happened. She just kept repeating one line over and over again. "It's still out there." Curtis quit not long after. Moved back to Montana. He doesn't answer emails anymore. I heard from a mutual friend that he doesn't go camping, doesn't even leave town. I stayed in the field, but I never went back to that part of the desert. I refused every job within 100 miles of that place. Sometimes, late at night, I'll pull up our maps, look at the coordinates we marked near the rocks. There's something off about them. The compass readings never lined up. The magnetometer went haywire. The area didn't appear correctly on any satellite image, like it didn't want to be seen. One time, a few months later, I went through Maria's notes. She'd written something strange on the last page of her notebook, the one I found at the wash. It said, "It watches during the day. It walks at night. It remembers." I don't know what she meant. But every now and then, I dream about that place. The circling steps, the cold rocks, the shadows standing too still, and I hear her voice as clear as that first whisper in the dark. It's still out there. Story the end. I was 27 when I took the job hauling supplies between Phoenix and a series of isolated construction sites out near the Arizona-Nevada border. Most of them were solar panel installations or modular housing projects for companies working on government contracts. The pay was good, better than anything I'd made back in Flagstaff working security gigs. It was quiet work, long drives, no one bothering you, until I took a job delivering to a site that shouldn't have been there. I first heard about Site 23 from a guy named Rick, who worked dispatch for the subcontractor we were contracted under. Rick was one of those guys who always looked like he hadn't slept. Red eyes, raspy voice, fingers stained yellow from chain smoking. He handed me a clipboard with coordinates, not an address, and muttered something like, "If they don't answer, don't wait. Just leave the stuff and go." I asked, "What's at Site 23? Rick looked around the yard, leaned in close, and said, "Nothing you want to know about." I laughed it off, thought maybe it was a joke or some paranoid vet type up in the hills, but something about his tone stuck with me. I plugged the coordinates into the GPS and headed out in the box truck loaded with food rations, water drums, a couple of solar batteries, and a crate of what the manifest listed as surveillance-grade visual equipment. The drive took me about 5 hours through some of the most godforsaken terrain I'd ever crossed. After I passed through Kingman and cut off on a back road called Bitterwash Trail, there wasn't another soul for miles. My cell lost reception after about an hour. It wasn't just bad reception. It was zero signal, like I'd driven off the grid entirely. The air was dry and thin, the kind of heat that makes your eyelids feel like paper. Wind gusts kicked up dust devils every couple of miles. It started feeling like the road was circling back on itself, even though the GPS still claimed I was headed straight. Then I saw it. 2 long metal fences stretching in a rectangle around what looked like several prefab units. No signs, no flags, just aluminum buildings surrounded by motion detectors on poles. There was a road that curved off from the dirt trail and a gate that was already open when I got there. No one came out to greet me. I honked once, waited. Nothing. The sun was starting to lower on the horizon, and that eerie orange glow settled over the desert. I figured I'd unload and be gone before dark. I backed the truck up to the edge of the compound and started dragging stuff out onto a dolly. As I wheeled the first load toward one of the structures, I heard a door creak open. A man stepped out. Tall, thin, wearing military-style fatigues with no insignia. His head was shaved, and he wore sunglasses even though the sun was nearly gone. He didn't say anything at first, just stared. Then he nodded slowly and said, "Leave it by the entrance." I asked if he needed help moving it inside, but he shook his head. "We don't let non-assigned personnel pass the threshold." I backed off, unloaded the rest. As I worked, I noticed more people watching from behind darkened windows, faces half hidden. Something about their posture was wrong, rigid like mannequins. I kept my eyes low and worked fast. Before I left, I handed the man the clipboard for him to sign off on the delivery. He didn't take it. He just said, "You were never here. Understand?" I forced a laugh. "I don't ask questions, man, just doing my job." "No," he said, stepping forward. "You were never here. If anyone asks, you broke down and turned back." I nodded slowly, backed away. As I climbed back into the truck, I caught something in the rearview mirror, movement on the roof of one of the prefab buildings. Something long and low to the ground, crawling. I couldn't make it out, but it slithered like a lizard, except it was too big. It dropped down the side of the building in complete silence. I didn't wait to see what it was. That night, I drove straight back to Phoenix. When I handed the clipboard to Rick, I told him what happened about the guy who wouldn't sign and what he said. Rick didn't even blink. He just tore off the delivery sheet and said, "Then that's what you tell anyone who asks." A few weeks later, I got called back to that region. Different coordinates, but same general area, deep in the desert near the Nevada border. This time, it was an emergency resupply. Apparently, a shipment hadn't arrived, and the site was completely out of food and water. I recognized the label on the manifest, Site 23. I didn't want to go. I told Rick I was having engine trouble, made up a lie about needing parts. He just looked at me and said, "They asked for you specifically." My stomach turned. The second trip was worse. This time the gate wasn't open, and no one came out when I honked. I considered leaving, but something told me if I turned around without delivering, it wouldn't go well for me. I got out and approached the gate. It was locked from the inside with heavy industrial chain. As I stood there, I felt something watching me again. Not from the windows this time, but from the desert itself. The silence was unnatural. No birds, no insects, no wind, a dense, pressing stillness. Then I heard the lock click. The gate creaked open an inch, just wide enough for me to squeeze through. I looked around but saw no one. I pushed the dolly through and began unloading again. One of the side doors to the largest unit was open just a crack. I swear I could hear whispering, dry, crackling sounds like static from an old radio. I stepped a little closer, hoping to maybe call out to whoever was inside, but the whispering stopped abruptly. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't the usual sweat and dust, it was metallic, like copper. Blood. I turned and left the rest of the supplies right there in the dirt. As I turned to go, something darted past the edge of my vision. A shape, black, low, fast. I spun around but saw nothing. Then I heard a high-pitched hum like feedback, building to a sharp crack, and the entire compound went dark. Whatever solar power they had went offline. The only light left was the dying red streaks of sun. I ran. I didn't stop until I was in the truck, speeding away, tires kicking up dust as I peeled off that godforsaken land. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept seeing those windows, those unmoving faces, and that thing on the roof. I knew something was wrong with that site. More than just secrecy or government work, it was unnatural. 2 weeks later, I saw a news report about a small earthquake near the Arizona-Nevada border. No major damage, but some equipment at a research facility had been compromised. The report didn't mention Site 23 by name, but the coordinates matched. I called Rick to ask what happened. No answer. When I went to the warehouse to check in for my next job, Rick was gone. No one knew where he'd gone. His desk was cleared out. I asked around, but people just gave me that look, the kind that means, drop it. A guy I used to get coffee with in the mornings finally pulled me aside and said, Rick was talking too much about that place, and said he saw a file with photos, people with their eyes stitched shut, skin grafted over their mouths, the kind of thing that doesn't belong in the desert or anywhere. I stopped hauling after that, but it didn't stop following me. About a month later, I started getting these phone calls in the middle of the night. No caller ID, just silence on the other end. Sometimes a faint static, other times the sound of wind, like the kind that blows across the open desert at night. One time I heard whispering again, same as at the compound, just one word, return. I moved back to Flagstaff and took a job at a hardware store. No more desert hauls. But sometimes I'll wake up to find sand on my windowsill. Not dust, actual sand. Coarse, red desert sand, like the kind from Bitter Wash Trail. I live on the second floor, no open windows. Once I opened the front door and found a box. No address, no label. Inside were photos, grainy black and white images of the Site 23 compound. But it wasn't the buildings. The photos showed the desert behind the compound, and shapes. Things half buried in the sand. Long, segmented bodies. Human hands emerging from where heads should be. Faces with too many eyes. I burned the box and photos that night. Still, I keep a flashlight and a baseball bat next to my bed. Because sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I hear the hum again, the one from the compound when the power died. Low at first, then louder, and I swear I can see a flicker of movement in the shadows near the closet. But when I turn the light on, there's nothing. Only the faint scent of copper in the air. Story the end. The desert had always been a place I thought I understood. Arid, quiet, and endless. Growing up in New Mexico, I'd spent countless summers camping out in the sparse wilderness near my hometown. But nothing prepared me for the night I spent near the ghost town of Goffs, California, where I encountered something that still makes the hair on my neck stand on end. I was working as a courier for a logistics company that specialized in deliveries to remote areas. One of my routes took me through the Mojave Desert, passing through tiny towns and stretches of empty highway that went for miles without a single soul in sight. My job was to deliver equipment to a scientific outpost near Goffs, a place where researchers were monitoring seismic activity and climate data. The scientists warned me the terrain was rough and to be careful. I left Barstow just before sunset, the sky a burnt orange as I headed east along Highway 66. The air in the truck was dry, the windows down to let the cool breeze in. As I got closer to Goffs, the landscape became more desolate. the cracked earth scattered with sun-bleached bones and shattered glass from forgotten relics of the town's heyday. I arrived at the outpost just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a small cluster of trailers and solar panels surrounded by a low chain-link fence. The researchers greeted me warmly, explained the equipment they'd been expecting, and I unloaded it quickly. They told me they'd be out there another week before they left. The night sky was stunning, full of stars I'd never seen so clearly. I set up my sleeping bag in the back of the truck, feeling a mix of excitement and unease. I knew the desert could be unforgiving, but something about that place felt different, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, I was awakened by a distant sound, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. It didn't sound like any animal I knew, more like something hitting rocks or wood slowly. I listened for a moment, but the outpost was silent aside from the occasional hum of solar panels. I stepped outside and the cold hit me hard. The desert temperature dropped dramatically after dark, and the wind picked up, swirling dust around my boots. I scanned the horizon with my flashlight, but saw nothing except the silhouette of distant mountains. The tapping continued, coming closer now, echoing oddly through the dry air. My heart pounded as I tried to locate its source. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the outpost fence, just beyond the range of the light. The figure was tall, unnaturally thin, and its skin seemed almost translucent under the moonlight. It wore tattered clothing, hanging loose from its frame like it hadn't been worn in years. The face was pale and gaunt, eyes sunken deep but shining with an eerie light. I called out, but the figure didn't move or respond. Instead, it lifted a bony hand and pointed toward the desert. I felt a sudden urge to follow, to see where it wanted me to go, but fear rooted me in place. The figure turned slowly and vanished into the darkness, leaving only the cold wind and a faint echo of the tapping behind. I locked the truck and tried to sleep, but the feeling of being watched lingered. When dawn finally broke, I packed up and left as quickly as I could. Weeks later, I heard from one of the researchers. They had discovered an old burial ground near the outpost, graves unmarked and disturbed, some freshly dug as if someone or something had been digging there recently. I never went back. Sometimes, when the wind howls through my hometown at night, I hear that tapping again, faint but unmistakable, and I remember the figure, still standing at the edge of the desert, watching, waiting. Story the end.